Section 1. The Nuclear Contamination Theory. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a town. It sits somewhere in the middle of America, the kind of America that feels familiar even if you've never been there. Wide streets, a main square with a fountain that's seen better days, a church on one corner, a bar on the other, a school somewhere in between, ordinary houses with ordinary yards, a donut shop that does more business than it probably should. Now look a little closer at the people living in this town. Their skin is yellow. Not a light tan, not the amber of a summer afternoon. Distinctly, unmistakably, permanently yellow, the color of old paper, of faded sunflowers, of something that has absorbed just a little too much of something it probably shouldn't have. Every single resident, every face you see, yellow. The town is Springfield, and we've been watching it for over 3 decades without asking the simplest possible question. Why does everyone look like that? The official answer, the one the show's creators gave in early interviews, the one most people accepted and then forgot, is that the yellow skin was an animation choice. Matt Groening wanted the characters to look immediately distinct when a viewer was flipping channels. Yellow popped. Yellow grabbed attention. Yellow made the family recognizable at a glance. And that explanation is fine. It's practical. It makes sense as a production decision. But it doesn't explain the fish. Let's begin at the beginning, or at least at one of the beginnings, the Springfield nuclear power plant, which has stood at the edge of town since the series started, belching smoke into an already gray sky, its cooling towers visible from almost anywhere in Springfield if you look in the right direction. The plant is run by Charles Montgomery Burns, who we'll spend a great deal of time with later in this script. For now, what matters is the plant itself, specifically, what the plant has been quietly doing to Springfield for decades. In the very first season of the show, a fish is caught in the river that runs near the plant. Its name becomes Blinky. Blinky has 3 eyes. The episode treats this as a political story. Mr. Burns running for governor, the fish becoming a campaign issue, the whole thing playing out as satire of environmental politics and corporate spin. Blinky is Exhibit A in an argument about whether the plant is contaminating the local water supply. Burns eventually wins the election anyway, which says something about the show's view of democratic accountability and how much weight a 3-eyed fish actually carries with voters. But Blinky doesn't go away. The fish keeps appearing. It becomes a background detail, a piece of Springfield's ecosystem, this mutated creature swimming in irradiated water that flows right through the heart of town. A creature that drinks from the same source as the residents. And the residents, all of them yellow. The theory begins here with a simple piece of environmental reasoning. If the water supply near a nuclear facility is contaminated enough to produce a fish with a 3rd eye, a mutation significant enough to be visible, significant enough to become a local celebrity, then what is that same water doing to the people who live nearby? The answer, according to this theory, is that it's turning them yellow. Now, let's talk about what radiation actually does to human skin, because this is where the theory gets its teeth. Chronic low-level radiation exposure, the kind you'd experience living near a malfunctioning nuclear facility for years, doesn't necessarily kill you outright. What it does is accumulate. It damages cells slowly, progressively, at a rate your body can sometimes compensate for and sometimes cannot. One of the documented effects of chronic radiation exposure is a condition called radiation-induced jaundice, where the liver becomes stressed by the consistent assault on the body's cellular structure. The liver, overwhelmed and damaged, fails to process bilirubin efficiently. Bilirubin, the yellow pigment produced when red blood cells break down, accumulates in the tissue, in the skin. The skin turns yellow. This isn't a fringe concept. This is documented medical science applied to a fictional scenario. The theory isn't asking us to accept anything supernatural. It's asking us to follow the logical chain. Contaminated water, contaminated town, contaminated people, yellowed skin. Every single Springfield resident, the yellow ones, which is all of them, is walking proof of the plant's effect on the population. But the contamination theory doesn't stop at skin color, because if it did, it wouldn't be much of a theory. It would just be a visual gag with a scientific footnote. What makes this theory genuinely compelling, what turns it from an observation into a framework, is everything else it explains. Consider the animals of Springfield. There are a remarkable number of mutated, unusual, or otherwise abnormal creatures living in and around the town. Blinky is only the beginning. There are glowing animals documented in later episodes. There are unusual creatures in the forest outside town. There are pets that display behaviors wildly inconsistent with their species. Springfield's wildlife, in aggregate, is noticeably wrong, noticeably different from what you'd expect from a normal American town. And then there are the people. Homer Simpson works at the plant. He has worked there for the entire run of the show, in various capacities, usually as a safety inspector, a role he obtained not through qualification but through a combination of accident, bureaucratic failure, and the plant's apparent indifference to hiring competent staff. Homer's IQ, when it's been measured on the show, comes in around 55. He is depicted throughout the series as forgetful, impulsive, easily confused, prone to long moments of vacancy, and capable of catastrophic lapses in judgment that somehow never quite result in the worst possible outcome. There is an episode, a pivotal one for this theory, in which doctors discover that Homer has a crayon lodged in his brain. A crayon from childhood pushed up through his nose decades ago, sitting in his frontal lobe, pressing against the tissue responsible for higher reasoning. When the crayon is removed, Homer's intelligence increases dramatically. He becomes thoughtful. He becomes articulate. He starts to understand the world more clearly, and what he sees when he understands it more clearly is so painful. The loneliness of being smart in Springfield, the inability to connect, the widened gap between himself and everyone he loves, that he eventually asks for the crayon to be put back. The crayon is reinstalled. Homer returns to his baseline. This is presented as a touching episode about belonging and the social costs of intelligence. But the contamination theory adds another layer. Why did Homer's brain allow a crayon to sit there for 30 years without the kind of cellular response that should have expelled or absorbed it? Why is his cognitive function so dramatically different from what it might otherwise be? The radiation, the theory suggests, has been working on Homer's brain the entire time. The crayon is only part of the story. The contamination is the context. Let's follow the logic further into the Simpson household. Bart Simpson has been 10 years old since 1989. He will presumably be 10 years old until the show ends. This is, of course, a feature of the floating timeline that animated series rely on. But the contamination theory offers a more specific explanation. The radiation permeating Springfield has disrupted the normal biological processes of aging. The entire town is caught in a kind of biological stasis, not because time has stopped, but because the cellular damage from chronic radiation exposure has created an equilibrium, a weird, terrible balance in which the body's degradation is precisely offset by its attempts at repair. Nobody gets meaningfully older. Nobody grows up in the way they should. The children stay children. The adults stay at whatever age they were when the exposure began to dominate their biology. This is disturbing if you sit with it. The yellow skin is cosmetic. The suspended aging is structural. Springfield is not a town that exists in a comfortable bubble of television logic. Springfield is a town whose residents have been quietly, irreversibly altered by decades of exposure to something that was never supposed to be there. And the entity responsible, the plant, its owner, its perpetually understaffed and underregulated operation continues to function every single day. Its cooling tower is still visible from anywhere in town if you look in the right direction. Now consider what the plant's documented safety record actually looks like, because the show has been remarkably consistent about this. In one episode, an inspection reveals that the plant has 342 documented safety violations. 342. The inspectors list them. They are not exaggerations. Exposed wires, malfunctioning cooling systems, leaking containment, improper disposal of radioactive materials, a break room that doubles as a storage facility for waste that glows. In another episode, the plant's disposal procedures are shown in detail. Waste barrels, the kind that should be handled with extreme care, transported in sealed containers, stored in certified facilities, are being thrown casually into a local pond. Homer tosses one out of his car window on the way to work. It rolls down a hill and comes to rest in what appears to be a residential neighborhood. These are played for comedy. They are absurd. They are outrageous. And they are also, in the context of the contamination theory, the precise mechanism by which Springfield became what it is. The plant didn't contaminate the town in one dramatic event. There was no explosion, no Chernobyl moment, no single day when everything went wrong and everyone knew it. It happened incrementally. A barrel here, a leaking pipe there, a cooling pond that feeds into the river. A river that feeds the water supply. A water supply that feeds every tap in every kitchen, in every yellow house in Springfield. Slow, quiet, continuous. And Montgomery Burns knew. He has always known. The inspection reports, the violation counts, the documented evidence of his plant's effect on the surrounding community, none of this is hidden from him. He simply doesn't care, or, more accurately, he has calculated that the cost of caring is higher than the cost of not caring, and he has made his decision accordingly. The people of Springfield are yellow, and their fish have 3 eyes, and their safety inspector has a crayon in his brain, and the man responsible for all of it sits in his tower and watches them through a monitor and presses his fingertips together and says, "Excellent." There's one more piece of the contamination theory that deserves attention before we move on, and it's the piece that makes the whole framework feel less like a fan theory and more like something the show has been telling us all along. In the episode Homer's Enemy, a man named Frank Grimes comes to work at the plant. Frank Grimes is, by every measure, a normal human being. He grew up in poverty. He worked hard. He studied. He earned his qualifications honestly. He is competent, careful, and deeply committed to doing his job properly. He has, in other words, all the qualities that Homer conspicuously lacks. Frank Grimes cannot understand Homer. He cannot understand how a man of Homer's obvious limitations has managed not only to survive, but to thrive, how Homer has a house, a family, friends, a bowling trophy, a picture with the president, how Homer continues to exist and even prosper in a world that, by any reasonable logic, should have ground him down long ago. Frank Grimes goes mad trying to understand it. He dies at the end of the episode, electrocuted after deliberately mimicking Homer's careless behavior to make a point that nobody around him seems to understand or care about. At his funeral, Homer falls asleep and starts laughing at something in his dream, and everyone laughs along with him. The contamination theory's reading of this episode: Frank Grimes is the outsider. He has not been exposed. He has not been altered. He comes from somewhere else and brings with him the expectations and standards of the uncontaminated world. And those expectations, those perfectly reasonable, completely normal human expectations, are absolutely incompatible with Springfield. Springfield doesn't follow the rules of the outside world. It follows its own rules, shaped by decades of low-level radiation, biological alteration, and a community that has collectively adapted to conditions that would horrify anyone looking in from outside. Frank Grimes didn't fail. The contamination theory argues that Frank Grimes was simply the only person in Springfield who could still see clearly. And Springfield, being Springfield, had absolutely no use for that. So the next time you picture that town, the wide streets, the donut shop, the church, and the bar on their respective corners, picture also what's underneath it. Picture the water table. Picture the cooling pond that feeds into the river. Picture the barrels at the bottom of local ponds, slowly leaching something luminous into the soil. Picture a fish with 3 eyes swimming in circles. Picture everyone you know with yellow skin, going about their lives, not asking why. Springfield is not a cartoon version of America. Springfield is what America looks like when nobody is watching the plant. When the inspector has a crayon in his brain. When the owner doesn't care. When the contamination is slow enough and quiet enough that by the time anyone notices, it's already everywhere. It's already in the water. It's already in the soil. It's already in the skin. Everyone is yellow. Nobody knows why. The cooling towers keep running, and somewhere in the river, Blinky swims on. Before we go any further into the mysteries of Springfield, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how many different corners of the world tune in for this. And if you haven't already, go ahead and hit subscribe. There's a lot more of this to come, and you won't want to miss it. Section 2. Homer's Coma. The Dream That Never Ended. There is a specific moment in Season 4 of The Simpsons that most fans remember as a funny episode about a prank gone wrong. Homer is buried under an avalanche of canned goods after Bart shakes a beer can and Homer opens it directly in his face. The explosion, cartoonishly large, hilariously disproportionate to the cause, sends Homer to the hospital with massive head trauma. He flatlines. Doctors work to revive him. He eventually comes back, technically alive, though the doctors note that he has permanently lost a measurable percentage of his brain function. The episode is called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. It aired in 1993. It was, like most clip shows of its era, partly designed to save money by reusing old footage. The coma is a framing device. Homer wakes up. Everyone moves on. The end. Except, what if he didn't wake up? What if Homer Simpson has been in a coma since 1993, and everything that has happened in the 30-plus years of the show since that episode is the interior landscape of a dying man's mind? This is the coma theory. It is, by any measure, the most emotionally resonant of all the Simpsons fan theories, and the one that does the most to explain the show's increasingly surreal later seasons. It deserves to be taken seriously, because when you follow it carefully, it doesn't just explain individual episodes, it explains the shape of the show itself. Let's establish the foundation carefully. Before the coma episode in the earlier seasons, particularly the first three, The Simpsons is a specific kind of show. It is grounded. The humor emerges from recognizable family dynamics, financial stress, parental frustration, sibling rivalry, the particular exhaustion of being middle class and middle-aged in a country that doesn't especially care about either of those things. The Springfield of the early seasons has weight to it. The problems feel real. Homer's job is boring and difficult. Marge's domesticity has a quiet, aching quality. Bart's rebellion is the rebellion of a child who feels unseen. The show is funny, but it's funny in the way that life is funny, the dark, slightly bitter way. After the coma episode, something shifts. The shift is gradual at first, and then it isn't. By the middle seasons, and certainly by the later ones, Springfield has become a place where Homer can travel to any country on Earth in a single episode, where celebrity guest appearances bend the rules of reality with increasing frequency, where the same characters who once felt constrained by economic reality now seem to exist outside of consequence entirely. Homer is injured in ways that should be permanently disabling. He faces situations that should fundamentally alter his life. And then the next episode begins and everything is reset. The coma theory says, this is what a coma dream looks like. The human brain, particularly a brain under severe stress, a brain that has experienced significant trauma and is fighting to maintain some kind of coherence, doesn't dream in straight lines. It dreams in loops. It returns to familiar settings and familiar faces because those are the landmarks it can hold on to. It introduces increasingly surreal elements because the deeper into the dream state the brain goes, the more the normal governors of reality, the filters that separate plausible from implausible, begin to fail. In the early part of a coma dream, things might feel almost normal. Familiar, a house you recognize, a family you love, problems you'd recognize from your waking life. Later, as the brain drifts further from the surface, the rules start to bend. The familiar people start doing things they'd never do. The geography stops making sense. The timeline fractures. Celebrities appear for no reason. You go to Brazil. You become a boxer. You fight God. You attend your own funeral. You travel to the future and back. Everything that has happened in The Simpsons since 1993 fits this pattern with uncomfortable precision. The theory has a specific trigger event that makes it more than just an observation about tonal shift. In the Season 3 episode Homer vs. Patty and Selma, which aired several months before the coma episode, Homer has a conversation with God. This isn't unusual for the show. Homer speaks with God several times across the series. But in this particular exchange, God makes a remark that is easy to miss on first viewing. God tells Homer that his time is coming. It's framed ambiguously. It could mean any number of things. But if you know what happens 5 episodes later in the following season, if you know that Homer is going to flatline on a hospital table, the remark takes on a different quality. A foreshadowing quality. God, or Homer's dreaming subconscious, or whatever you want to call the authorial voice behind that moment, is telling you, pay attention to what's about to happen. Homer's time comes. He flatlines. And then the theory asks he never fully comes back. One of the most compelling aspects of the coma theory is what it does with the celebrity appearances. The Simpsons has featured an extraordinary number of celebrity guest voices over its run. Musicians, actors, athletes, politicians, writers, scientists. The list is absurdly long and cuts across virtually every domain of human achievement and fame. Many of these celebrities appear as themselves, interacting directly with the Simpson family, often in ways that defy any reasonable reading of how that interaction could plausibly occur. Why would a comatose Homer's brain generate so many celebrities? Because Homer, lying in a hospital bed, is presumably exposed to television. The TV is on in his room. It cycles through programming news, talk shows, entertainment, famous faces flicker past. His brain, in its dreaming state, incorporates these faces into the only narrative it has. The story of his family, the story of Springfield, the ongoing loop of the life he's trying to hold on to. The celebrities aren't guests on the show. They're ambient input. They're whatever was playing on the hospital room, TV, bleeding into the dream. This reframes every single celebrity appearance in the show's history. Michael Jackson appearing and claiming not to be Michael Jackson. Tom Jones, Paul McCartney, Stephen Hawking. They're not there because the writers thought it would be entertaining to have these people cross into Springfield. They're there because Homer's brain is doing what a dreaming brain does, pulling in fragments of the world outside and weaving them into something familiar. The aging question or the non-aging question fits seamlessly into the coma framework. One of the most frequently discussed strange aspects of The Simpsons is that nobody ages. Bart has been 10 for over 30 years of real time. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been a baby. Homer and Marge have remained somewhere in their late 30s. The show has occasionally acknowledged this, sometimes through meta-humor, sometimes through deliberate vagueness about dates and timelines, but never explained it in any way that makes sense from within the show's reality. A coma dream explains it completely. Dreams don't age their participants. When you dream about your childhood home, your parents look the way they looked when you were a child. When you dream about your own family, they exist at whatever age they exist most powerfully in your emotional memory. Homer's children are young because that's how his mind holds them as the young children he was still raising when he went under. His wife is the age she was when they were in their prime. The house is the house as it was. Nothing needs to age because nothing is actually living. Everything is a memory, perfectly preserved, replaying on a loop. The longer the coma continues, the more elaborate the loop becomes. New scenarios, new crises, new joys. But always the same people, always the same ages, always the same house on Evergreen Terrace. There is a season 34 episode that the coma theory community points to with particular intensity. The episode in question apparently features what's described internally as a possible dream sequence, in which a version of Homer briefly wakes up in a hospital environment confused, disoriented, reaching for a face he doesn't recognize in the room around him. The scene is ambiguous enough that the show can deny it's meaningful. And deny it the show did, or rather, the showrunner Al Jean, when asked about the coma theory in interviews over the years, has consistently said the show is not in a coma. Homer is not dreaming. It's all real. But here's the thing about that denial. It is exactly the denial you would write if you wanted to preserve the theory's ambiguity while maintaining deniability. Al Jean's response to the coma theory is not, "That's completely wrong, and here's why." It's, "That's not what we intended," which is a different statement entirely. Intentions and meanings are not the same thing, especially in a show as densely layered as this one. And it's worth noting that the show's writers have, on multiple occasions, written episodes that seem to acknowledge the coma theory without confirming it, episodes that play with the idea of Homer's consciousness, that blur the line between his reality and his imagination, that return to the hospital bed of 1993, as if something about that moment has unfinished business. The emotional center of the coma theory, the reason it resonates so deeply with so many fans, is not the surreal later seasons or the celebrity cameos or the frozen ages, it's the family. Homer loves his family. This is the bedrock of the show across all 30-plus years and hundreds of episodes. Whatever else changes, whatever else the show becomes in its later iterations, the emotional core is the same. Homer loves Marge. Homer loves his children. Homer would do anything to stay with them. If Homer is in a coma, then the entire show is a testament to that love. Every episode, the funny ones, the strange ones, the ones that don't quite work, the ones that are inexplicably beautiful, is Homer's mind refusing to let go, refusing to stop telling the story of his family, refusing to drift away from the house on Evergreen Terrace and the woman he married and the children he's been raising since before the coma took him. The loop isn't a malfunction. The loop is devotion. Homer keeps dreaming because there's something on the other side of the dream that he can't face. The possibility that he won't wake up. The possibility that the life he's living inside his mind is the only version of that life he'll ever have. And so he keeps going. He keeps making mistakes and fixing them and making them again. He keeps eating the donuts. He keeps going to work at the plant he hates, for the boss he fears. He keeps coming home to Marge. He keeps coming home. The coma theory has one final element that elevates it from fan speculation to something approaching genuine literary interpretation. The show ends every episode almost without exception, with the family together. Whatever chaos has unfolded over the previous 22 minutes, whatever fights have erupted or disasters have been narrowly averted or relationships have been tested, the ending finds the Simpsons on the couch in the living room, together, safe. That couch gag at the beginning of every episode, which has become one of the most iconic visual elements in television history, each variation ends the same way. The family on the couch, together, home. A comatose man dreaming of his family would dream them exactly that way. He would dream them safe. He would dream them home. He would dream them on the couch, together, every single time. Because the alternative, his dreaming mind is working so hard not to reach, is the hospital room where his body is lying, and the absence of that couch, and the absence of that family, and the silence where their voices used to be. He keeps them on the couch because that's the one thing he needs to be true. The couch is the dream. The couch is everything. Section 3. Who really shot Mr. Burns? In the summer of 1995, The Simpsons did something no animated television show had ever done before. It set up a genuine mystery. A cliffhanger of the kind you'd expect from a prestige drama, planted at the end of a season finale, designed to send its audience into months of speculation and debate. Mr. Burns had been shot. The episode, Who Shot Mr. Burns?, aired in 2 parts, the finale of Season 6 and the premiere of Season 7, and it was accompanied by a real-world contest. Fox invited viewers to submit their best guess at the shooter's identity. The answer, they promised, was in the episode. All the clues were there. A sharp-eyed viewer could figure it out. Hundreds of thousands of entries were submitted. The contest received enormous coverage. America, in the summer of 1995, was genuinely invested in who had shot a cartoon billionaire. And here is the fact that the coma theory community, the fan theory forums, and the most obsessive Simpsons analysts keep coming back to: nobody won. Not a single entry among the hundreds of thousands submitted correctly identified the shooter before the premiere. Not one. The official explanation is that viewers simply didn't notice the right clue: the sundial scene, the gun falling into Maggie's hands. The evidence was there. The story goes, people just missed it. But the deeper theory argues something more unsettling. The mystery wasn't solved because the mystery didn't have a clean answer. Not originally. Let's begin with what we know from the episodes themselves. Mr. Burns is shot at Springfield Town Hall during a confrontation in which he has just revealed his plan to block the sun from the entire town, a scheme so audacious and so personally damaging to every resident of Springfield that the episode essentially constructs a list of suspects. Nearly every major character in the show has a motive. Homer, whose job was threatened because that Burns; Barney, whose oil well was stolen; Principal Skinner, humiliated publicly. The list runs through almost the entire cast. Burns falls. The town is cast into darkness. The question hangs over the summer. When the premiere airs, the answer is Maggie, baby Maggie, apparently acting accidentally when the gun fell into her hands during a confrontation in Burns' office. A confrontation in which Burns, upon discovering the infant in his personal belongings, grabbed her and began to shake her while calling her a relentless little savage. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. Maggie did it, but in a context that frames it as reflex, as self-defense from an infant, as something almost accidental. Except the episode also frames it as something else. Burns, as he recovers, tries to tell investigators who shot him. He speaks. His words come out garbled, incomprehensible. At one point, when pressed to identify his attacker, he produces what looks like the letter M, which investigators initially read as pointing to Homer, whose middle initial is J. But the M isn't for Homer. The sundial, the writers explained in retrospect, pointed to Maggie. The gun's serial number contained a reference to her. The evidence, they insisted, was all there. And yet, nobody found it. Nobody won the contest. Here is where the deeper theory emerges. Multiple Simpsons writers and crew members have in interviews spread across the years since 1995, made remarks that are difficult to reconcile with the official story of a carefully planted mystery. One writer noted that the Maggie reveal was finalized relatively late in the production process. Another remarked that there was genuine internal debate about who the shooter should be, that different writers favored different suspects, and that the decision wasn't made by consensus. Most significantly, there was a version of the story in which Smithers did it. Wayland Smithers, Burns's devoted personal assistant, was the original suspect in early drafts and was written as the shooter in at least one version of the script. A fully animated sequence was reportedly produced in which Smithers confesses. That sequence does not appear in the broadcast episode. Smithers is instead cleared early in Part 2 through an alibi. He was at a meeting of a group dedicated to the memory of a specific celebrity, and the investigation moves on. Why would you animate a full confession scene for a suspect you weren't going to use? The theory's answer: you wouldn't. Not unless you were still deciding. The Smithers angle reveals something important about the mystery's structure. If Smithers had been the shooter in the original draft, the motive was clear. Burns had done something, the sun-blocking scheme, or some personal betrayal that finally cracked 30 years of pathological devotion. Smithers, who has subsumed his entire identity into servitude to this man, finally reaching a point where the devotion breaks and something underneath it, rage perhaps, or grief, comes through. That would have been a powerful story, a dark story. A story about what happens to a person who dedicates their life entirely to someone who doesn't see them as a person. It was the story that, from a pure character logic standpoint, made the most sense. Instead, the show went with Maggie, and the episode has a wonderful quality. The absurdity of a baby being the answer to a question that had the whole country guessing, but it required the writers to construct the clues retroactively to fit the answer they'd chosen. The sundial clue, examined closely, is ambiguous enough to point in multiple directions depending on what you're looking for. The gun in Maggie's hands is presented as accidental. The motivation is essentially absent. An infant doesn't have a motivation for shooting someone, even in self-defense, in the way that a motivated adult character does. The mystery was solved, in other words, in a way that was simultaneously charming and slightly evasive. The answer was Maggie, but the question was never really, who pulled the trigger? The question was, who wanted to? And the answer to that question has no single clean response. Almost everyone in Springfield wanted to. The gun just happened to end up in the one pair of hands that couldn't be legally tried for the act. There is a third layer to this mystery, and it involves the episode's most overlooked moment. When Burns is confronted in his office by Maggie when the gun falls and discharges, and Burns is shot, his response as he falls is a single sentence, spoken quietly, that the episode does not linger on. He says, "Oh, it's you." Think about that for a moment. Oh, it's you. Not "oh no" or "help" or any expression of surprise or pain. A recognition. A specific recognition of a specific person. Burns sees who shot him. He knows who shot him. And his response is not surprise. His response is something more like acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of someone who sees a face they weren't expecting but, in some way, recognizes. How does a man recognize the face of the person who shot him in that specific way and have it be an infant he's met once? The theory suggests that, "oh, it's you," is directed not at Maggie but at someone else who was in the room. Someone whose presence Burns recognized, someone the episode doesn't show us. Who else was in Burns' office that day is never made entirely clear. The episode's editing in that sequence is notably tight. We see very little of the room, very little of what happened before the gun discharged. There is space in that scene for another person. There is space in the narrative for a version of events that is more complicated than the one we were given. Let's talk about Homer's own relationship to this mystery, because it's strange. Homer is the show's primary suspect through most of Part 2. His name is brought up first. His motive is strong. His behavior after the shooting is suspicious in ways the episode plays for comedy, but that, taken straight, are genuinely odd. He is frantic, disoriented, unable to account for his whereabouts, in possession of a gun he can't explain. In a later season, season 18, in a flash-forward episode, Homer appears to confess to shooting Burns. The context is complicated, and the confession is framed in a way that makes it deniable. But it's there. It exists in the text of the show. Homer at some point suggests that he did it. If Homer did it, If Homer's presence in that scene was more than the show wanted to show us in 1995, then the entire structure of the two-part episode looks different. The investigation becomes not just a detective story, but a cover-up. The show would have concealed Homer's role behind the more acceptable story of an accidental infant shooting because the alternative Homer Simpson as deliberate shooter, as a man so desperate and so broken by his employer that he picked up a gun, is too dark for the version of the show it was trying to be. The Maggie reveal is funny and surprising and works beautifully as entertainment. But the theory suggests it's a substitute for a story the show was not quite ready to tell in 1995. The story of a man who had been ground down, humiliated, exploited, and threatened for long enough that something in him finally broke. That story is still in the text, if you know where to look. The gun that was in Homer's possession, "Oh, it's you," the season 18 confession that was slipped in 18 years later, quietly, in a future set episode where nobody would look too hard. The mystery of who shot Mr. Burns has an official answer. Maggie, accidental, case closed, but the mystery of why it happened, and what the show was really trying to say, and what was in that office before the gun went off, that mystery has never been resolved. It may never be resolved. It may be the kind of question that the show, for all its length and complexity, deliberately left open, because some mysteries, if you answer them too clearly, stop being mysteries. And a town like Springfield needs its mysteries. They're what hold it together. Section 4. The Immortality of Charles Montgomery Burns. Every show needs a villain. The Simpsons has had many antagonists over the years, various authority figures, occasional criminals, recurring nemeses for specific characters. But its central villain, the one who returns episode after episode as a permanent fixture of Springfield's power structure, is Charles Montgomery Plantagenet Schicklgruber Burns, known to everyone simply as Mr. Burns. Burns is the richest man in Springfield. He owns the plant. He owns the local television station, a uranium mine, a professional hockey team, and at various points of the show's history, he appears to own significant portions of the town itself. He is cadaverously thin. His skin has a color that, in the context of the contamination theory, means something specific. He walks with a cane and moves with the hesitancy of someone who isn't entirely sure which direction their legs are planning to go. He appears to be somewhere between 100 and 140 years old. This is treated as a joke. Burns makes references to incredibly historical events as personal memories. He recalls the 19th century. He has fought in wars that ended before anyone currently living was born. He once had a bear named Bobo that he can trace back to a childhood in what sounds like pre-modern America. But here's what the immortality theory asks. What if it isn't a joke? What if Burns actually is that old? And what if the mechanism of his longevity is hiding in plain sight right there in the plant he owns, in the substance he has spent his life in proximity to? The theory begins with radiation biology, specifically with a phenomenon that cancer researchers have been studying for decades, the relationship between radiation exposure and cellular regeneration. At very high doses, radiation kills. This is well documented and not in dispute. But at specific, carefully managed doses that are harmful over the long term, but not immediately lethal radiation, has a paradoxical effect on certain cellular processes. It can disrupt the normal cycle of cellular death and replacement. In some documented cases, it appears to slow certain markers of aging at the cellular level, at least temporarily, as the body mobilizes its repair mechanisms to deal with the ongoing damage. This is not magic. This is not science fiction. This is a genuine area of biological research, and the findings are strange enough that they've attracted serious attention. Now apply this to Burns. Burns has spent the majority of his extremely long life in proximity to nuclear material. He owns a nuclear plant. He has presumably been receiving whatever the show describes as his regular medical treatments, the ones that keep him functional despite appearing to be a man whose body should have given out at least 40 years ago. Those treatments, the theory argues, are precisely calibrated radiation exposures, just enough to keep the cellular regeneration process disrupted, just enough to maintain the strange equilibrium in which Burns's body neither thrives nor gives out. He is not immortal in any mystical sense. He is maintained, sustained, kept at a specific biological steady state by technology and intentionality. The show has given us several windows into Burns's medical situation, and they are all deeply strange. In one episode, Burns undergoes a full medical examination. The results baffle the doctors. Burns, they conclude, is somehow simultaneously afflicted with every disease known to medicine, a condition so improbable that it achieves its own kind of stability, like a building so riddled with structural problems that none of them can actually fall because they're all holding each other up. His body, in other words, is in an equilibrium of catastrophic failure. Every system is compromised, and yet he keeps walking. The doctors call this Three Stooges syndrome. This is funny. It's also, in the context of the immortality theory, a precise description of what chronic low-level radiation exposure does to a biological system over decades. Each system is damaged. Each system is also constantly struggling to repair itself. The result is a body in perpetual crisis that never actually crosses the line into total collapse because the crisis itself has become the baseline. Burns is not healthy. Burns has never been healthy in any conventional sense. Burns is a biological impossibility held together by the same forces that created him. Let's think about Smithers. Waylon Smithers is Burns' personal assistant, his companion, his shadow, and the show has made clear over the course of many years someone who loves Burns with an intensity that goes far beyond professional loyalty. Smithers has dedicated his life to Burns. He manages Burns' schedule, his correspondence, his public relations, his security, and apparently his personal well-being at a level of detail that suggests Smithers knows things about Burns' health that Burns' actual doctors might not. The immortality theory assigns Smithers a specific and crucial role. He is not just an assistant, he is a life support manager. Consider what Smithers actually does on a day-to-day basis. He accompanies Burns everywhere. He manages what Burns eats and when. He oversees his medical appointments. He is present at what the show sometimes vaguely references as Burns treatments, procedures that are never specified in detail but that clearly happen regularly and clearly have something to do with keeping Burns functional. If those treatments are calibrated radiation doses, if the mechanism keeping Burns alive is the same substance that powers the plant Burns owns, then Smithers' role is not administrative. It's medical. It's custodial in the deepest sense. He is the person who manages the system that keeps Burns alive. This reframes their entire relationship. The devotion is still there. The love, one-sided and strange and sad in the ways the show explores, is still there. But beneath all of it is a practical dependency that neither of them may fully acknowledge. Burns cannot maintain the system that sustains him without Smithers. Smithers is not just Burns' most loyal servant. He is the only thing standing between Burns and the death that has been waiting for him for a century. The theory gets more interesting when you look at Burns' family. The show has, over the years, introduced various members of Burns' lineage. His ancestors appear in historical flashbacks and holiday episodes. His family tree extends back through generations, and in every depiction, the Burns family is associated with wealth, power, and a certain relationship to the darker possibilities of industry and exploitation. There is a reading, not the official one, but a persistent fan reading in which the Burns family has been doing what Burns is doing for multiple generations. That the nuclear plant is the current expression of something the family has been involved with since before nuclear technology existed, and that whatever keeps Burns alive now has earlier, cruder equivalents that kept his ancestors alive longer than they should have been. The family dynasty in this reading is not just an inheritance of wealth, it's an inheritance of methodology, of the knowledge of how to sustain oneself past the point where the body should give out, passed down through generations of Burns men, each finding the technological version of the treatment appropriate to their era. Montgomery Burns is the current and most sophisticated practitioner of a family art that is very, very old. One more element deserves attention before we leave Burns and his extraordinary longevity. There are multiple episodes in which Burns encounters people who apparently knew him significantly earlier in his life, people who should, by any actuarial logic, be long dead. Burns treats these encounters with a casualness that suggests they're not unusual to him. He has outlived colleagues, enemies, business partners, and apparently several generations of families who worked for or against him. The show plays this as comedy. Burns' age is a running gag. His references to Abraham Lincoln as a personal acquaintance, his fondness for entertainment forms that haven't existed in a century, his confusion about any technology developed after approximately 1930. All of it is played for laughs. But under the comedy, if you're looking for it, is something that reads less like a joke and more like a portrait of what it actually costs to live that long. Burns has no contemporaries. Everyone he grew up with, everyone who knew him when he was young, gone. The world has changed around him so completely that his references and his memories and his baseline assumptions are not just outdated, they're from a different world. Burns is powerful. Burns is rich. Burns controls most of what happens in Springfield. And Burns is profoundly, irreversibly, perhaps uniquely alone. The immortality theory doesn't make Burns sympathetic. The things he has done to maintain his position and his life are not sympathetic things. But it does make him tragic, in the way that all the best fictional villains are tragic. He achieved the thing he wanted. He has lived longer than anyone should. He has kept the body going when the body should have stopped. And the cost is that he lives in a world populated entirely by people who weren't there when he started. A world he has watched change and change and change until the version of it he recognized has become invisible, buried under everything that came after. He presses his fingertips together and says, "Excellent." And somewhere inside that word is a man who has been saying excellent for 140 years and who long ago forgot what it felt like to expect something and have it genuinely surprise him. Section 5. The Principal and the Pauper Springfield's Machinery of Denial. There is an episode of The Simpsons that fans hate more than almost any other. Not because it's boring, not because it's offensive in a way that hasn't aged well, because it reveals something about Springfield that the show had always kept just below the surface, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The episode is called The Principal and the Pauper. It aired in Season 9, in September of 1997. It is consistently ranked among the worst episodes in the show's history. Harry Shearer, who has voiced Principal Skinner since the very beginning, publicly expressed his displeasure with the storyline. The backlash was immediate, sustained, and has never quite subsided. Here is what happens. A man arrives in Springfield claiming to be the real Seymour Skinner. He is a decorated Vietnam veteran. He was captured as a prisoner of war and presumed dead. He survived. He escaped. He came home to find that someone had been living his life. The man the town has known as Seymour Skinner, the principal of Springfield Elementary, the meek, nervous, eternally put upon son of a demanding mother, is actually a man named Armin Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, he was a street hustler, a petty criminal, a young man with no family, no identity worth keeping, no future. When the real Skinner was presumed dead, Tamzarian traveled to Springfield to deliver the news to Skinner's mother. She mistook him for her son. She needed him to be her son. And Tamzarian, who had never in his life been needed by anyone quietly, became Seymour Skinner. He kept the name. He kept the life. He kept the mother. For 20 years. The town finds out. The real Skinner stands in front of them. The truth is not ambiguous or complicated. It is sitting right there in human form, with documentation and witnesses and the unmistakable authority of someone who actually is who he claims to be. And Springfield holds a meeting to decide what to do. The vote is unanimous. They choose to keep the lie. A legal decree is issued by Judge Snyder declaring that Armin Tamzarian is legally and permanently Seymour Skinner. The real Seymour Skinner, the actual veteran whose name and identity were borrowed without his knowledge or consent, is physically tied to a train car and removed from Springfield. The judge makes it explicitly illegal to ever refer to the events of that day again. The penalty, the episode notes, is torture. Fans found this outrageous. How could the show do this to a beloved character? How could it unmake decades of continuity? How could it ask the audience to accept that everything they knew about Skinner was a fiction? But the theory, the one that makes this episode not the worst in the show's history, but arguably the most important, asks a different question. What if Springfield didn't do anything unusual? What if this is exactly what Springfield always does, and this is simply the first time the show let the audience watch the mechanism in action? Think about how many times Springfield has collectively forgotten something that should have permanently changed it. The dome. In the Simpsons movie, the entire town is placed under a glass dome by the Environmental Protection Agency because the pollution has reached catastrophic levels. This is not a small event. This is the federal government physically containing a community because it has been classified as an environmental hazard. This happens. It is canon. And by the next episode, back to normal. No dome. No investigation. No follow-up from the EPA. No discussion of what happened. Springfield simply doesn't remember. Burns blocking the sun. An act of industrial sabotage so enormous that it threatened the survival of every living thing in town. It's resolved, the sun comes back, and within an episode or two, the relationship between Springfield and Burns is more or less what it always was. The town has been invaded, rebuilt, devastated by weather, shaken by earthquakes, visited by celebrities, attended by presidents, and in each case, the next episode begins fresh. The slate is clean. The community has, through some mechanism that the show never identifies, agreed to move forward as though the previous catastrophe was a dream. The Principal and the Pauper is the one episode that shows you how that mechanism works. The town didn't forget about Armin Tamzarian. The town voted to forget deliberately, with full awareness. A legal structure was built around the forgetting to ensure that it held, and anyone who refused to participate in the forgetting the real Skinner with his inconvenient existence was physically removed from the community. That's not cartoon logic. That's a social contract. Small communities do this. Real ones, in the real world. Any sociologist or historian of small-town American life can point to examples of communities that have collectively decided that a particular truth is too destabilizing to acknowledge, that the cost of confronting what actually happened is higher than the cost of maintaining the agreed-upon version of events. The secret that gets buried. The scandal that gets quietly reclassified as a misunderstanding. The person who pushed too hard for accountability and found themselves gradually and then suddenly outside the community they were trying to hold accountable. Springfield is a cartoon, but this dynamic is not cartoonish. It is depressingly, recognizably human. The theory that emerges from The Principal and the Pauper is not about the Tamzarian storyline specifically. It's about what that storyline reveals as the operating principle of Springfield's reality. The town is not amnesiac because something is wrong with its residents' memory. The town is amnesiac because the residents have an agreement, formal or informal, conscious or unconscious, to maintain a shared version of reality and to actively resist any information that would require them to revise that version. The contamination theory and the denial theory are deeply compatible. They explain each other. The contamination theory says, the radiation from the plant has damaged the residents' cognitive function, including the parts of the brain that enable critical thinking, the formation of troubling conclusions, and the capacity to sit with uncomfortable truths. The denial theory says, the residents have developed a cultural and social architecture specifically designed to prevent the formation of those troubling conclusions, independent of any neurological damage. In combination, you get a community that cannot question the plant, whether because it literally cannot process the question, contamination, or because it has collectively agreed not to ask it denial, or, most disturbingly, because it has been doing both for so long that the neurological and the cultural have merged into something that is indistinguishable from normalcy. Springfield doesn't look like a town under siege. It looks like a town having a pleasant, slightly chaotic time. People go to the donut shop. They attend school board meetings. They watch their local news anchor. They live their lives. The mechanism underneath all of that, the systematic suppression of inconvenient truth, the social exile of anyone who won't play along, the legal apparatus that makes honesty criminal is invisible because it's working exactly as intended. There's a character who functions as the purest symbol of this dynamic, and his name is Frank Grimes, which we mentioned earlier in the contamination section. But it's worth returning to him here in the context of denial. Frank Grimes was not driven out of Springfield. He drove himself out, or rather, Springfield's reality drove him to his own destruction. His offense was not that he brought external facts into Springfield and demanded they be acknowledged. His offense was that he genuinely could not understand why they weren't being acknowledged. He couldn't see the mechanism. He couldn't see the agreement. He watched Homer sleep through work, accidentally destroy equipment, cause minor disasters without consequence, and be rewarded with the cheerful affection of everyone around him, and he processed this as an injustice, a malfunction, something that needed to be corrected. He didn't understand that it wasn't a malfunction. It was a feature. Springfield doesn't reward competence. Springfield rewards participation in the shared fiction. Homer participates fully and unconsciously because Homer's version of reality and Springfield's version of reality are the same version. He doesn't need to pretend everything is fine. For Homer, everything is fine. Frank Grimes could see that it wasn't. And in Springfield, that vision was not a gift. It was a sentence. The real Seymour Skinner on his train car, moving away from Springfield, represents every person who has ever told a small community an unwelcome truth and been removed for it. He is the environmental scientist who tested the water and found something alarming, and found themselves suddenly without funding, without a job, without a platform. He is the journalist who started asking questions about the plant and discovered that the town didn't want those questions asked. He came home from a war. He survived things that should have broken him. He came to reclaim what was his name, his identity, his mother, and the town tied him to a train because the lie was comfortable, because the lie was known, because the truth would have required them to revisit 30 years of what they thought they understood about their school and their principal and their community, and that revisitation was more painful than the alternative. The alternative being, send the veteran away and never speak of it again. Springfield did not become a strange, self-contained, increasingly surreal town by accident. It became what it is through practice. Through decades of choosing comfort over accuracy, choosing the agreed-upon narrative over the contradicting evidence, choosing the familiar lie over the disturbing fact. Every reset, every episode that ends and begins fresh, with no consequences from what came before, is a vote. Every season that begins as though the previous season's catastrophes didn't permanently alter the town is a decree. The jury is always unanimous. The real Skinner is always on the train, and the law says you are not allowed to talk about it. Section 6. Maggie Simpson, the quiet apex. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for over 36 years. She communicates primarily through pacifier movements and the occasional pointed stare. She cannot walk without falling. She cannot form sentences. She has, by every developmental metric, the capabilities of an infant. And she is, by almost every meaningful measure of intelligence and capability, the most powerful person in the Simpson family. This is the Maggie theory. It is not the most famous theory about the Simpsons, and it is not the most elaborate, but it is, in some ways, the most elegant, because it takes a character who has always been treated as background furniture and repositions her as the central figure in a quiet drama that has been running, silently, in the margins of the show for as long as the show has existed. Let's begin with what she has actually done. Maggie Simpson allegedly shot Charles Montgomery Burns, the most powerful man in Springfield. The word allegedly is doing work here. We've already spent considerable time with the ambiguities of that mystery, but even in the official version of events, a 1-year-old child was involved in the shooting of a billionaire and faced absolutely no legal consequences because of her age. The fact that no charges were filed isn't a footnote. It's a result. Whatever happened, Maggie emerged from it entirely unscathed, while the richest man in town spent time in a coma. She organized and led what can only be described as a prison break at a daycare facility. In the theatrical short film The Longest Daycare, which was nominated for an Academy Award, which is itself worth sitting with for a moment, a theatrical short about a baby navigating a daycare center was considered for an Oscar. Maggie is placed in a facility run with authoritarian efficiency. She identifies a threat, a bully baby who is systematically destroying the caterpillars in the facility's garden. She forms a plan. She executes it across multiple stages, adapting when things go wrong, finding alternative routes when her initial strategy fails, ultimately succeeding in releasing the butterfly that the caterpillar has become. She does all of this silently. She does all of this without anyone else in the facility understanding what she's doing. The staff sees a baby moving around. Maggie sees a tactical problem with multiple variables and solves it. The gap between what others perceive and what is actually happening is the central fact of Maggie's existence. There have been multiple episodes in which Maggie's intelligence is directly tested, and the results are never quite the same. Different episodes, different contexts, different measurements. But the pattern is consistent. Maggie registers at levels that exceed the test's ability to measure, or that place her in categories the testers weren't expecting. or that produce in the adults around her a brief flicker of recognition this baby is something unusual, followed almost immediately by a return to treating her as a baby. The theory about why this happens connects to the contamination framework we established earlier. The radiation from Burns's plant has been shown to produce a range of effects in Springfield's residents. In Homer, it suppressed cognitive function. In other characters, it appears to have produced physical mutations, behavioral changes, disruptions of the expected biological baseline. Maggie's mutation, the theory argues, ran in the opposite direction from Homer's. The same environmental cause, the same exposure, the same irradiated water and air, but in Maggie, instead of suppression, it produced amplification. Her intelligence isn't just high, it's structurally different. It operates in ways that don't fit neatly onto any scale that was designed to measure ordinary human intelligence. Homer and Maggie are, in this reading, two poles of the same phenomenon. He is what happens when the environmental pressure collapses a mind inward. She is what happens when that same pressure forces a mind outward into territory that doesn't yet have a name. But the intelligence alone doesn't fully explain Maggie. Lots of intelligent characters in fiction are simply depicted as intelligent, they say smart things, they solve problems, they're recognized as bright. Maggie's intelligence is defined by concealment, by the deliberate strategic choice to not be recognized. This is where the theory becomes genuinely fascinating. Look at Lisa Simpson and what has happened to her intelligence over the show's history. Lisa is brilliant. Lisa is, within the world of Springfield, a prodigy, a child of exceptional ability, surrounded by people who either don't understand her or are threatened by her. The show has depicted over and over the social cost of Lisa's visibility. She announces herself as the smartest person in the room. She corrects people. She advocates. She pushes back. She refuses to go along with things she knows are wrong. And Springfield grinds her down for it. Consistently, episode after episode. The community doesn't reward Lisa's intelligence. It tolerates it at best, punishes it at worst. Lisa's brilliance is her defining characteristic and also the primary source of her suffering. Being the smartest person in a community that doesn't value intelligence is its own particular kind of loneliness. Maggie watched this happen. Maggie has been watching it since the day she was brought home from the hospital. She has processed the data of Lisa's experience with the systematic thoroughness of a mind that misses nothing, and Maggie drew the obvious conclusion. Visibility is a liability. If being obviously intelligent means being targeted, corrected, isolated, and reduced, then the rational response to possessing that intelligence is to hide it, to maintain the performance of normalcy. To exist in plain sight as exactly what everyone expects you to be, which is a baby, so that no one ever looks closely enough to see what's actually there. There are specific moments in the show that only make sense through the lens of this theory. After the Burns shooting, in the closing scene of Who Shot Mr. Burns? Part 2, the investigators have left. The family has dispersed. Maggie is alone in the room. She looks around carefully. The show makes a point of showing her eyes moving, checking each corner, confirming she is not being observed. Then she mimes the act of firing a gun with her pacifier. The official reading is that this is the show confirming Maggie's guilt. She's reenacting the shooting. Case closed. The theory's reading is different. A baby acting in self-defense, accidentally causing a gun to discharge, does not subsequently wait until she's alone to rehearse the motion. That sequence, the checking of the room, the deliberate wait for privacy, the controlled reenactment describes not a baby reliving a traumatic accident. It describes a person reviewing a significant event in private, for reasons they have decided others should not see. That is not infant behavior. That is the behavior of someone who understands exactly what they did and has decided that their ongoing safety depends on nobody else understanding it. The silence itself is the strongest evidence. Maggie's first word, a single word, spoken once and never repeated, was voiced by Elizabeth Taylor in a cameo that the show treated as an event. "Daddy?" She said it. The family reacted with wonder and joy. And then Maggie never spoke again in any meaningful way. The coma theory reading of this is that Homer's dreaming mind gave his youngest child one gift, one moment of connection, and then withdrew it. Because the dream can give Homer the sound of his baby saying his name, but can't sustain it. The gift is too precious to become ordinary. The theory about Maggie's deliberate silence offers a different reading. Maggie heard her own voice. She measured its effect on the people around her. She saw what happened when she used language, the explosion of attention, the immediate shift in how she was perceived, the dramatic change in what people expected from her. And she stopped, not because she couldn't do it again, because she decided the return on speech was not worth the cost of being seen. A baby who doesn't talk is furniture. A baby who can talk is suddenly a subject of intense interest, study, and expectation. The invisibility Maggie has cultivated for 36 years depends entirely on the people around her, continuing to see a non-verbal infant. The moment she speaks, that invisibility ends, so she doesn't speak. She watches, she listens, she processes. She occasionally acts decisively, strategically, effectively in situations where action is required. And then she returns to the pacifier and the blank expression and the perfect performance of being exactly what everyone expects her to be. What is she waiting for? This is the question the theory ultimately cannot answer, because the show has never answered it. Maggie's arc, if she has one, if there is somewhere she is going with all of this accumulated patience and intelligence and strategic invisibility, has never been resolved. The show has offered flash-forward episodes in which adult Maggie appears briefly, but these glimpses are always ambiguous, always partial. What we know is that she is waiting for something, that the silence is purposeful, that the patience is not passive, it is the patience of someone who has decided that their moment has not yet arrived and who is not willing to spend their advantage before the right situation presents itself. In a town where Burns runs everything, where Homer is compromised, where Lisa fights and loses repeatedly, where the adults around her have been shaped and damaged by decades of exposure to things they can't acknowledge, Maggie sits in her high chair and sees all of it clearly. She is the only member of the Simpson family who has never been fooled by Springfield. She is the only one who has never participated in the forgetting. She remembers everything, the shooting, the daycare, every moment she has watched from behind the pacifier, and the enormous eyes and the performance of infancy. And she is, presumably, still deciding what to do about it. When it happens, when Maggie finally acts on whatever she has been planning across 36 years of watchful silence, Springfield will not see it coming. The show has built this tension with extraordinary patience. Every episode in which Maggie is present, in the background, observing, unnoticed, is another page in a document that may never be finished but has been accumulating for a very long time. The quietest member of the Simpson family, the most dangerous person in Springfield, still waiting, still watching, still sucking on that pacifier, which by now should mean something entirely different to you than it did before. Section 7. The Simpsons predictions, prophecy, pattern, or something stranger. At some point in the last decade, a specific type of social media post became unavoidable. You've seen it. A screenshot from an episode of The Simpsons, sometimes grainy, sometimes clearly captured from a DVD placed side by side with a photograph from a real news event. The caption is always some variation of, "They predicted it again." The Simpsons predicted the Trump presidency. The Simpsons predicted the Disney-Fox merger. The Simpsons predicted smartwatches. The Simpsons predicted a specific type of video call technology. The Simpsons predicted a pandemic originating from Asia, complete with panic buying and masks. The Simpsons predicted Cypress Hill performing with the London Symphony Orchestra. The internet receives each of these revelations with a mixture of wonder and unease. How? How does a cartoon written in the late 20th century keep lining up with events in the 21st? What is happening inside those writers' rooms? The answer, as usual with The Simpsons, exists on multiple levels simultaneously. There is a logical debunking level that explains most of what's happening. There is a more interesting cultural influence level that explains something the debunking misses. And then there is a third-level stranger, harder to name, that the most analytical fans keep circling back to. Let's take them in order. The logical explanation first, because it deserves a fair presentation. The Simpsons has produced, as of this writing, nearly 800 episodes across 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of satirical observations, speculative jokes, technological extrapolations, and cultural predictions. When you multiply that volume of content across that span of time, the simple mathematics of probability say some of it is going to align with future events. If you write 1,000 jokes about what technology will look like in 20 years, and you employ writers who understand technology trends, some of those jokes will turn out to be accurate. If you write hundreds of satirical pieces about American politics and celebrity culture, and you employ writers who understand how American celebrity culture and politics work, some of those pieces will turn out to describe things that actually happen. This is not magic. This is volume plus insight plus time. The Simpsons writing staff has historically been extraordinary in its composition. Writers from Harvard, from Yale, from other elite academic institutions, people with backgrounds in mathematics, in computer science, in political science, in history, people who read widely and think carefully and have spent their careers studying the patterns of American life. These are not people guessing. These are people observing trends and following them to their logical conclusions. They saw Donald Trump's interest in running for president, an interest he had been publicly, loudly expressing since the late 1980s, and wrote a joke about the logical endpoint of that trajectory. They saw media consolidation accelerating and wrote a joke about its inevitable conclusion. They saw technology getting smaller and more personal and imagined what it might look like on a wrist. The writers didn't predict anything. They read the present more carefully than most people do and then pushed it forward. The debunking also requires acknowledging something uncomfortable. Confirmation bias is doing enormous work in the predictions phenomenon. The Simpsons has made thousands of predictions that did not come true. Jokes about jetpacks, jokes about moon colonies, jokes about technological developments that took entirely different forms than the show imagined, jokes about political outcomes that went the other way, jokes about cultural shifts that never happened. Nobody screenshots those, nobody posts them. Nobody builds viral content around the moment The Simpsons said something would happen and it didn't. The predictions phenomenon is, at its foundation, a selection bias problem. We filter the show's enormous output through the sieve of, did this come true? And then we see only the content that passed through. The remainder, the vast majority of the show's speculative content, is invisible because it didn't match reality and therefore doesn't generate the kind of post and share response that the matches do. What looks like an astonishing rate of accurate prediction is actually a normal rate of accurate prediction in an enormous dataset, made to look astonishing by the selective visibility of the confirmed predictions. Al Jean, who has been executive producer of the show for most of its run, has said exactly this: the darts and dartboard metaphor. If you throw enough darts, some of them will hit the bullseye. The Simpsons throws more darts than any other show in television history. But the debunking, satisfying as it is intellectually, leaves something on the table. Because there are specific predictions in this show that are difficult to account for purely through volume and trend extrapolation. The Trump prediction, for example, it's easy to explain the general concept: a celebrity with political ambitions runs for president. That's trend extrapolation. But the specific visual, the escalator descent, the way the campaign announcement looked, that alignment is more precise than trend extrapolation usually produces. The show didn't just predict a Trump presidency. It depicted visual details of Trump's political career in ways that feel less like projection from existing data and more like specificity that shouldn't have been achievable from a 1990s baseline. The Siegfried and Roy prediction is similar. The show depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers. Not an exotic animal causes an incident involving a performer. A white tiger attacking, that is specific enough that calling it coincidence requires a small act of will. These don't disprove the statistical explanation. They are still consistent with the darts and dartboards model at a mathematical level. But they create a residue, a small, nagging residue of unexplainedness that the statistical model doesn't fully dissolve. The more interesting theory about the predictions isn't that the show is prophetic, it's that the show shapes reality. The Simpsons is one of the most widely watched, most frequently quoted, most deeply embedded pieces of American cultural output in the history of the medium. Billions of person-hours have been spent watching this show. Its jokes are woven into the language. Its characters are part of the American imaginative landscape in a way that very few fictional constructs have ever achieved. When The Simpsons depicts an event, when it makes a specific joke about a specific cultural development, that depiction enters the cultural bloodstream, it becomes a reference point. It becomes a shared image, a shared concept, something millions of people carry in their mental inventory of possible futures or possible events. And cultural familiarity shapes what people find imaginable. It shapes what seems normal, what seems plausible, what seems like something that could happen. The Simpsons depicting a Trump presidency didn't predict Trump's presidency. It made a Trump presidency feel like a thing that could happen. It put the idea into cultural circulation. It made the concept familiar, which made it slightly less alarming when it began to seem possible, which made it slightly easier to accept, which in some diffuse and impossible to quantify way contributed to a cultural environment in which such a thing was thinkable. The show doesn't read the future. The show writes drafts of possible futures, and we absorb those drafts, and sometimes we live them out. There's a meta level to this that becomes genuinely dizzying if you follow it far enough. The Simpsons is the longest-running scripted primetime television show in American history. It has been running for so long that there are adults in their 30s who grew up watching it and have children of their own who grew up watching it. Multiple generations have absorbed the same jokes, the same cultural references, the same satirical observations about American life. What does it do to a culture to have the same satirical lens applied to it continuously for 36 years? One answer. It creates a population that has been pre-acclimated to certain ideas. The corrupt billionaire as a fixture of civic life, the incompetent government as a background assumption, the nuclear facility as an accepted neighbor. These are ideas that The Simpsons has been normalizing first as satire, then as familiar reference, then as just the way things are for longer than most of its audience can clearly remember. The predictions aren't strange because the show is prophetic. They're strange because the show has been shaping our expectations for so long that when reality catches up to the satire, it feels less like a coincidence and more like something that was always going to happen. We were prepared for it. The show prepared us. One last element of the predictions phenomenon deserves attention before we move on, and it's the one that ties most directly to everything else we've been discussing about Springfield. The Simpsons predictions, when you look at them as a body of work rather than as individual instances, are not random. They cluster around specific themes: corporate power expanding beyond its supposed limits, technology becoming more intimate and more surveillance-oriented, political celebrity growing inseparable from entertainment celebrity, the gap between the very wealthy and everyone else becoming simultaneously wider and more normalized. These are not random observations. These are the central observations of a show that has, from the beginning, been about what happens to ordinary people in a society that has been captured by forces that don't particularly care about them. Burns is the thesis statement. Springfield is the case study. If The Simpsons has predicted things, it has predicted them because it has been pointing at the same dynamics, the same structural realities, the same vectors of power and powerlessness for 36 years. And those vectors have continued moving in the directions the show identified. That's not prophecy. That's consistency. And consistency over 36 years in a show that has been absorbed by multiple generations of viewers starts to look indistinguishable from prophecy to the people who grew up on it. Springfield was always a reflection. We stared into it long enough that the reflection became familiar. And now, when reality looks like something Springfield already showed us, it feels like the cartoon came first. But the cartoon was always showing us the present. We just didn't notice until the future caught up. Section 8. Mona Simpson and the Three-Generation Conspiracy. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official story. Abe Simpson, Homer's father, had told him early and clearly, "Your mother passed away when you were young." He showed Homer a grave. Homer mourned. In the way Homer mourns things with a dull, generalized sadness that sits just beneath the surface of his usual affect, not quite articulated but always present. A kind of background grief that explains a lot about why Homer is the way Homer is, if you're willing to look for it. And then season 7 arrived, and the episode Mother Simpson aired in November of 1995, and everything changed. Homer's mother was alive. She had been alive the whole time. The grave Abe had shown him was not hers. It belonged, the episode reveals, with a dry absurdity that doesn't cushion the underlying seriousness, to the poet Walt Whitman. Abe had been passing off a literary monument as his wife's headstone for the entire duration of Homer's life. Why? Because the truth was more complicated than a dead mother. Because the truth involved a conspiracy, a fugitive, a billionaire, and a biological weapons lab in the middle of a town where the residents were busy not noticing the three-eyed fish. Mona Simpson, Homer's mother, voiced in her most significant appearances by Glenn Close, is one of the most important characters in the show's history. She appears in very few episodes. She has limited screen time relative to her narrative significance. She is, in many ways, a ghost who only becomes a presence when the show needs to explain why Homer is the way Homer is. In 1969, Mona was a housewife. She was married to Abe. She had a young son named Homer who was about to start school. She lived in Springfield. Her life was ordinary. And then the world outside Springfield changed in ways that the world outside Springfield was changing. In the late 1960s, the civil rights movement, the protests against the war in Vietnam, the counterculture, and something in Mona changed with it. She was radicalized. She became an activist. She joined a group of people who were opposed, specifically, to biological weapons development in the United States, and they had identified a target. Charles Montgomery Burns, owner of the Springfield nuclear power plant, was operating a biological weapons laboratory, not a nuclear facility, a germ warfare facility. A laboratory designed to produce weaponized pathogens, located inside the community where Mona was raising her child, where children were playing in yards and drinking from garden hoses and doing all the ordinary things children do. Mona and her group broke into the lab. They destroyed what was inside. And on the way out, Mona made the mistake that changed everything. She stopped to help someone who had fallen during the chaos of the raid. She reached down, offered her hand, helped the person up, and looked at their face. The person was Burns. He saw her. He identified her. He went to the FBI. And from that moment, Mona Simpson was a federal fugitive. She couldn't go home. She couldn't contact Abe without putting him in danger. She couldn't explain anything to Homer without creating a paper trail that Burns could follow. She couldn't do anything except disappear. She went to Homer's room that night. She held him while he slept. She kissed him goodbye. He didn't wake up. She was gone by morning. Homer woke up and his mother wasn't there. Abe, when pressed, told him she was dead. And Homer, who was 6 years old, who was too young to question the story, who trusted his father's word, believed it. He grew up believing he was motherless. He grew up carrying the weight of a maternal abandonment that he had no way to process correctly because he had the wrong information about what had actually happened. The grief he felt wasn't "my mother died." The grief he felt, though he could never name it properly, was "my mother left me," which is a different grief entirely. A grief with blame in it. A grief with a question underneath. What did I do that made her go? Everything about Homer, all the psychological architecture of his personality, the need for approval, the terror of abandonment, the way he clings to Marge with an intensity that goes beyond ordinary love and into something that looks more like desperation, the way he absorbs humiliation from his employer without resistance, the way he pursues the affection of people who don't particularly value him, all of it traces back to a 6-year-old boy who woke up and his mother was gone. The contamination theory explains Homer's cognitive limitations as a product of radiation exposure. The coma theory explains his experience of reality as the product of a brain injury. But the Mona theory explains Homer's emotional architecture, which is the part of him that shapes his choices, his relationships, and his decisions in ways that his cognitive function cannot fully account for. Homer's psyche was formed around a wound. The wound was inflicted deliberately by circumstances that Burns created, not the wound of losing his mother to death, which Homer could have processed and survived. The wound of losing his mother to absence, to a disappearance he couldn't explain or understand, which left a gap in him that he has been trying to fill ever since. Burns knew. This is the central horror of the Mona theory, and it requires a moment to sit with. When Homer came to work at the nuclear power plant, when Burns hired this shuffling, confused, inexplicably persistent applicant to serve as safety inspector, in the facility Burns would have known who he was hiring. Homer Simpson is the son of Abraham Simpson, and Abraham Simpson's wife, Mona, was the woman who destroyed Burns's biological weapons laboratory. The woman Burns had been pursuing through federal channels for decades. Homer carried his mother's last name. Burns, who has a memory that functions with extraordinary precision for grudges, would have known, and he hired Homer anyway. Not despite knowing, because of it. There is an episode that confirms a version of this arrangement, a deal between Abe Simpson and Burns. in which Abe's silence about some crime Burns committed was traded for a guarantee of Homer's perpetual employment, no matter how badly Homer performed. No matter how many safety violations Homer failed to catch, how many disasters Homer's incompetence contributed to Burns was contractually obligated to keep Homer employed. This is presented as a peculiar background detail, a clever explanation for the running joke of Homer's indestructible employment. But read through the lens of the Mona theory, it becomes something darker. Burns needed Homer at the plant. Homer's incompetence was not a liability to Burns, it was a feature. A competent safety inspector would have shut the plant down. A competent safety inspector would have caught the 342 violations and demanded they be addressed. A competent safety inspector would have started asking questions about the water, about the fish, about the effects on the surrounding population. Homer, damaged and distracted and cognitively compromised and emotionally devastated by a childhood wound he could never properly name, Homer asked none of those questions. Homer went to sleep at his console. Homer ate his donuts. Homer did not look at the cooling towers and wonder what they were leaking. Burns engineered this. By driving Mona out of Homer's life when Homer was 6 years old, Burns ensured that the adult Homer who would eventually come to work at the plant was precisely the Homer Burns needed, broken in the specific ways that made him useful. There's a late series episode in which Homer's intelligence is temporarily restored, the crayon episode we've already discussed. When Homer can think clearly, the first thing he does is look at his life with genuine comprehension. He looks at his job. He looks at his employer. He begins, for the first time, to see the connections. He has the crayon put back in, because seeing clearly in Springfield is unbearable. And the theory argues it was always going to be unbearable for Homer specifically, because what Homer would see if he could see clearly is the full architecture of what was done to his family. The biological weapons lab, his mother's exile, Burns's knowledge, the deal with Abe, the 30-plus years of working for the man who made him what he is. The crayon isn't just cognitive suppression, it's mercy. Homer's brain in some sense chose not to be able to understand what had been done to him. Mona Simpson eventually dies in a later season. The episode in which this happens is one of the show's quietest and most carefully constructed. Homer sits with her. He holds her hand. She says what she can. He hears what he's able to. There are no jokes in the scene where she goes. The show, for once, doesn't reach for the reset. It sits with the weight of it. Homer loses his mother twice. The first time, he was 6 years old and didn't understand what had happened. The second time, he understood everything, and the understanding was both better and worse than the not knowing had been. Better because he finally knew that she had not left because she didn't love him. Worse because he finally knew all the years and all the distance and all the damage that had been done, and could see it clearly enough to feel the full weight of it, which the crayon had been protecting him from. 3 generations of Simpsons, bent out of shape by one man's grudge and one town's inability to resist the power he wielded. Mona fought back and lost everything. Abe made a deal and buried himself in the terms of it. Homer inherited the consequences and lived inside them his whole life without fully understanding what they were. Burns remained at the top of all of it, pressing his fingertips together, saying, "Excellent. Some things in Springfield don't change." Some things in Springfield were never going to change, because the person with the power to change them decided a long time ago that things were exactly as he wanted them. And the rest of Springfield, yellow, forgetful, contaminated, trapped in their beautiful loop, kept going. Section 9. Where is Springfield, the town that doesn't want to be found? Springfield is the most famous fictional American town in history. More people can name Springfield than can name the capital of most American states. More people can describe Springfield in detail: the power plant on the edge of town, the elementary school, the nuclear facility's cooling towers, the bar called Moe's, the convenience store called the Quick E-Mart, the church, the police station, the highway overpass. The gorge then can describe the capital city of the state they grew up in. And yet nobody knows where it is. Not because the show hasn't tried to tell us. The show has, across 36 years and hundreds of episodes, provided an enormous number of geographic clues. Area codes, license plates, state abbreviations glimpsed on official documents, references to neighboring states, descriptions of the local climate, the proximity of various geographic features, mountains, coastlines, deserts, prairies that would, if they could all be placed simultaneously on a real map? Describe a location. The problem is that they can't be placed simultaneously on a real map because the clues contradict each other. Springfield borders Ohio in one episode and Kentucky in another and Nevada in a third. It has mountains in one episode and ocean beaches accessible in a single afternoon in another. Its climate ranges from blizzard conditions to desert heat waves, sometimes within a single season. The state abbreviation NT appears on one document. NT is not a U.S. state abbreviation. Springfield is not in any state because Springfield is, geographically, impossible. Matt Groening, the show's creator, solved the mystery himself in 2012. In an interview with Smithsonian Magazine, he revealed that Springfield was named after Springfield, Oregon, near where he grew up. He chose Springfield partly because of the personal connection and partly because it is one of the most common city names in America. There is a Springfield in nearly every state. The name could belong to anywhere. For about 48 hours, the mystery was solved. Springfield was in Oregon. Case closed. And then the show aired its next episode, which placed Springfield's geography in a context that was inconsistent with Oregon in several obvious ways. And the episode after that did the same. The writers, apparently, had not gotten the memo from their own creator, or had gotten it and decided to ignore it, because the Springfield they wrote for was not in Oregon. It was in the same impossible nowhere it had always occupied. Groening's confession was accurate about the inspiration for the name. It was not a reliable guide to where Springfield actually exists, because Springfield, as a place, has been deliberately constructed to resist existing anywhere specific. Why would a show do this? The surface answer is the most commonly cited one: universality. If Springfield is everywhere, it belongs to everyone. If you can't pin it down to a specific state, a specific region, a specific climate and culture, then every viewer in every part of the country can see their own town in it. The insularity of a small New England town. The flat suburban sprawl of the Midwest, the industrial decay of the Rust Belt, the sunny dysfunction of the Sun Belt. Springfield absorbs all of these because it is a composite, and composites don't have specific addresses. This is true. The writers have confirmed this. The ambiguity is intentional and serves the show's purpose. But under the framework of the theories we've been exploring, the geographic impossibility takes on a more interesting texture. Consider the contamination theory. If the radiation from Burns's plant has done to Springfield's residents what the theory suggests, if it has bent their biology, disrupted their aging, produced mutations that defy normal human physiology, why would the same radiation stop at the human body? Why would a force powerful enough to give a fish a third eye and turn an entire population yellow leave the physical landscape untouched? The contamination theory's answer? It doesn't. The radiation from Burns's plant has warped the physical geography of Springfield in the same way it warped everything else. The mountains that shouldn't be next to the ocean, the desert that shares a county with the forest, the climate that cycles through seasons that don't correspond to any regional reality. These are not animation errors or lazy writing. They are a physically contaminated landscape, compressed and warped by decades of nuclear exposure, existing in a state of geographic mutation that mirrors the biological mutation of the people living in it. Springfield has three-eyed geography. Its terrain is as altered as its residents. The coma theory offers a different but equally compelling explanation. Homer's dreaming mind doesn't have a precise geographic memory of America. It has fragments, impressions. The mountain that appeared outside a car window on a family vacation, the beach from a television commercial, the desert highway glimpsed in a movie, the farmland of a childhood road trip. A dreaming brain doesn't organize these fragments geographically. It organizes them emotionally. It places them according to what they mean rather than where they are. The mountain appears near Springfield because mountains feel like the outside of places, and Springfield is a place with an outside. The ocean is accessible because oceans represent something expansion, escape, possibility that Homer's dreaming mind associates with the world beyond the town. Springfield's geography is not a map, it's a feeling. It's the emotional landscape of a man who is dreaming about the town where his family lives, assembled from every piece of America he ever absorbed and arranged according to the logic of longing rather than the logic of cartography. There is also a legal dimension to the geographic ambiguity, and this one connects directly to the denial theory from The Principal and the Pauper. No regulatory authority has consistent jurisdiction over Springfield. Think about what that means in practice. The EPA, which in the movie finally acts against Springfield, exists as a federal entity that presumably supersedes state authority. But the EPA's ability to act within a specific state also depends on state-level cooperation, on documented jurisdiction, on the kind of administrative paper trail that requires a specific, stable location to exist. If Springfield is simultaneously in multiple states, if its geographic position is genuinely ambiguous, genuinely shifting, genuinely undetermined, then every regulatory body that might otherwise hold Burns accountable is working with incomplete information. Which EPA office is responsible? Which state's environmental agency has authority? Which attorney general's office is the right one to call? The answer, as far as Springfield is concerned, is never quite clear. The jurisdiction floats. The oversight slips through the gaps. Burns does not live in a town. Burns lives in a regulatory no-man's land, protected by ambiguity, sustained by a geography that refuses to commit to any authority that might make demands of it. The town's location is its most effective defense mechanism. Every state in America has been theorized as Springfield's home. At various points in the show's history, geographic clues have pointed convincingly at Ohio, Nevada, Missouri, Oregon, Kentucky, Maine, Virginia, and Illinois, among others. Each theory has its compelling evidence. Each theory also has equally compelling counter-evidence from different episodes. The show has made a sport of this. It places geographic Easter eggs for fans to find, hints that seem definitive until they turn out to be red herrings, clues that point in confident directions before doubling back. The writers know the audience is looking. They keep moving the target. What emerges from this sustained geographic evasiveness is a town that is, in some sense, defined by its resistance to definition. Springfield's identity, to the extent it has one, is rooted in its refusal to be pinned down. Its geography is part of its character. The impossible combination of features isn't a mistake. It's a portrait. Springfield is the town that could be anywhere. Springfield is the town that is everywhere. Springfield is, in the deepest sense of the show's ambition, the town that belongs to whoever is watching, which means it belongs to everyone, and therefore to no fixed point on any map. You can't find it because it was always wherever you are. The cooling towers are visible from your house too, if you look in the right direction. The fish in your river might have more eyes than you've counted. Springfield is not somewhere else. That's the point. That's always been the point. Section 10. The Floating Timeline, Why Nobody Grows Old. Bart Simpson was 10 years old when The Simpsons debuted on the 17th of December, 1989. He is 10 years old right now. Lisa was 8 years old in 1989. She is 8 years old right now. Maggie was 1. She is 1. Homer and Marge were somewhere in their late 30s. They are somewhere in their late 30s. 36 years of real time have passed. 0 years of Springfield time have passed. Every industry professional who works in animation will tell you this is normal. Standard practice. The floating timeline, the convention in which a show's present is always the viewer's present while the characters remain frozen at their initial ages, is as old as serial animation itself. The Flintstones did it. Scooby-Doo did it. Every long-running animated series has done some version of it. But The Simpsons has done it for longer than any other show in history. Long enough that the floating timeline has stopped being a convenience and started being a phenomenon. Long enough that the show has begun generating continuity contradictions so significant that they've become their own category of fan analysis. Long enough that the characters' backstories have had to be rewritten multiple times to keep up with a present that keeps moving forward while the characters stand still. Here is the most visible evidence of the timeline strain. When the show began, Homer and Marge's backstory was rooted in the late 1970s. They met in high school during the disco era. Homer's teenage years were scored by classic rock. Marge wore a prom dress appropriate to the period. The cultural markers of their youth were specific and consistent. Watergate, the oil crisis, bell-bottoms, the summer of 1974. As the floating timeline dragged the present forward, that backstory stopped making sense. If Homer and Marge are in their late 30s now in 2025, they weren't teenagers in 1974. They were teenagers in approximately 2003. Their high school years weren't marked by Watergate. They were marked by the early internet, by instant messaging, by reality television, by the cultural vocabulary of the early 2000s. The show has adapted to this. In flashback episodes across different seasons, Homer and Marge's youth has been progressively updated. They were grunge fans in one era of flashbacks, hipsters in another. Their origin story has been rewritten at least 4 times, each version setting their formative years a decade later than the previous one, each version using the cultural markers appropriate to whatever era the floating present has moved them into. This means Homer and Marge don't have a fixed past. Their history is a draft that keeps being revised. Their memories are unstable. Their origin story is a moving target. The theories converge on this point with unusual unanimity. The coma theory says, nobody ages because the dreaming mind of a comatose man cannot imagine his children growing up. He wasn't there to see it happen. His mental image of them is frozen at the age they were when the vending machine fell. The dream preserves them as he last knew them, because that's all his brain has to work with. The contamination theory says, the radiation has disrupted the normal biological process of aging at the cellular level. The residents of Springfield are not growing older because their cells have been altered by decades of exposure to something that has broken the expected progression of human biology. The denial theory says, Springfield collectively refuses to acknowledge the passage of time, because acknowledging time means acknowledging everything that time would bring with it: consequences, changes, the accumulation of all the things the town has been working so hard to forget. The Burns immortality theory says, if Burns has found a way to extend his life through technology and wealth, then the concept of aging is already negotiable in this universe. The rules that govern normal human biology do not apply universally in Springfield. They never did. All 4 theories arrive at the same place. Time in Springfield is not functioning normally. The characters are not frozen because the show is lazy. They are frozen because something radiation, or a dream, or collective denial, or the machinery of a very old man's empire is holding them in place. The show knows this. There are episodes that demonstrate exactly what Springfield would look like if the freezing stopped. Lisa's wedding is the clearest example. In this Season 6 episode, Lisa is shown as an adult, a young woman in her 20s, living in England, engaged to be married. The episode flash-forwards to this future with real specificity and emotional richness. Adult Lisa is recognizable as who she's been becoming. Throughout the show's run, highly educated, idealistic, still searching for a connection that feels right, still carrying the specific loneliness of being the smartest person in any room. The episode is beautiful. It works. The characters feel like real adults, like people who have grown in the directions the show always suggested they would grow. And then, it ends. Lisa returns to being 8 years old. The future is put away. The door closes. The permanent present resumes. The show can imagine its characters as adults. It has proven repeatedly that it can tell those stories, that they have real emotional weight, that there's a version of The Simpsons set in an aging Springfield that would be worth watching. It refuses to tell that version. It keeps the door closed. Every flash forward is a glimpse through a window that is never left open. Why? The answer that the theories converge on, and the answer that the show's own structure supports, is that letting the characters age means ending the show. And ending the show means admitting something that nobody, not the writers, not the network, not the audience, is quite ready to admit. 36 years have passed. The audience that watched the premiere on the 17th of December 1989 is now, depending on how old they were then, somewhere between their late 30s and their 60s. The children who watched early Simpsons episodes with their parents are now parents themselves, watching with their own children. The world in which the show premiered no longer exists. The cultural context, the economic context, the America that made Homer and Marge's specific struggles feel recognizable, that America has changed so completely that it is almost unrecognizable in some ways. The jobs, the houses, the middle-class stability that the show depicted as precarious but possible, the specific economic landscape of the late 1980s and early 1990s that gave the show its grounding has been so thoroughly transformed that the early episodes sometimes feel like period pieces. Letting The Simpsons age would require acknowledging all of this. It would require the show to look directly at what 36 years of real time means for Homer and Marge and their marriage, for Bart and Lisa as adults navigating a world radically different from the one their childhoods were set in, for Maggie as a young woman in an America that the show's early seasons couldn't have fully imagined. That would be a profound show. It would be an important show. It would be one of the most ambitious things a network could attempt. It would also require saying, this is what we've become. This is what the time has done. This is what happens when 36 years go by, and you have to stop pretending they haven't. And the show will not do that. The timeline will keep floating. Bart will stay 10. The couch will stay the same. The credits will keep playing, week after week, as they have played since 1989. The floating timeline is, in the end, a mirror held up to the audience as much as to the characters. We keep watching. We keep tuning in. We allow the illusion of stasis because we need it, because the Simpsons frozen in time are also us frozen in time. The version of ourselves that remembers watching this show when we were young, sitting in our parents' living room, laughing at Homer and Bart in a world that felt permanent and safe. The show will not let the characters age because we will not let the characters age. Every viewer who tunes in expecting to find Bart at 10 and Lisa at 8 is casting a vote for the stasis. Every person who says, I grew up watching The Simpsons, and then sits down to watch another episode is maintaining the loop as much as Burns, as much as the denial machinery, as much as the radiation or the coma or any of the other forces the theories identify. We built the loop. We're inside it too. Springfield's timeline floats because we're holding it up. And as long as we keep watching, as long as the loop stays intact and the credits keep rolling, and Homer keeps falling through the door at 5:30 after another day at the plant, The Simpsons will stay exactly as they are. 10 years old, 8 years old, 1 year old, late 30s, forever young in a town that will never change. Because we need them there. We need them to stay. Section 11. Hans Molleman, Ned Flanders, and the Hidden Darkness. Not every mystery in Springfield belongs to the Simpson family. Some of the show's most unsettling undercurrents run through characters who exist at the periphery, background figures, recurring faces, the people who populate Springfield's streets and diners and church pews without ever quite becoming central to the main story. Two of these peripheral characters carry, between them, a significant portion of the show's unexplored darkness. One of them dies constantly and keeps coming back. The other has never been allowed to be angry, and the reasons why tell you more about Springfield than almost anything else the show has depicted. Let's start with the dying man. Hans Molleman is a small, elderly, nearly blind man who has been appearing in the background of Springfield scenes since the show's early seasons. He has a flat, expressionless voice. He wears thick lensed glasses. He moves slowly, with the careful gait of someone who is not entirely certain of the ground beneath his feet. He dies constantly, not in the Treehouse of Horror episodes, which are explicitly non-canonical, not in dream sequences or fantasy segments. In regular episodes, canon episodes, Hans Molleman is hit by cars, crushed by falling objects, buried alive, consumed by animals, electrocuted, incinerated, and on at least one occasion simply explodes. He dies dozens of times across the show's run, and then he appears in the next episode, alive, ready to die again. No explanation, no resurrection scene, no acknowledgement that he was dead in a previous episode. He simply returns, as if death in Springfield is, for Hans Molleman specifically, a temporary condition. The show has given us one concrete fact about Molleman that everything else contradicts. He has stated his age as 31. Look at Hans Molleman and consider 31. He appears to be somewhere between 80 and 200 years old. His skin is deeply lined. His posture suggests decades of accumulated compression. He has the physical profile of a man who has lived far longer than 31 years and not enjoyed most of it. If he is 31, something has aged him catastrophically. Something has taken a man who should be in the prime of his life and transformed him into a figure from whom time seems to have extracted everything it can. The contamination theory has an answer for this. Among the various effects of chronic radiation exposure documented in real-world research, accelerated aging is one of the most consistent. Cells that are continuously damaged and forced to regenerate at abnormal rates undergo a process that resembles compressed aging, telomere degradation, cumulative DNA damage, the progressive failure of systems that would, under normal conditions, last decades longer. Hans Molleman, in the contamination framework, represents the extreme end of this process. He is the Springfield resident who received the highest exposure, whether because of where he lives relative to the plant, or because of something specific about his biology or because of a combination of both and his body reflects that exposure in every visible way. He is 31 years old. He looks 90. The radiation compressed 5 or 6 decades of aging into the time he's been in Springfield. And his repeated deaths and returns? The same radiation that accelerated his aging also mutated his cellular regeneration in ways that make death less permanent for him than it would be for anyone else. His body reconstitutes. His cells rebuild. He comes back, ready for the next catastrophe, the next car, the next boulder. Hans Moleman is not a gag. Hans Moleman is the contamination theory's most concentrated expression. He is what Springfield does to a person when it gets the fullest possible chance to do it. Now for the darker character, the one whose darkness is harder to see, because it is dressed in the most recognizable form of goodness the show offers: Ned Flanders. Ned is, on the surface, everything Homer is not. He is patient, he is generous, he is devoutly religious, actively kind, financially responsible, physically fit, and perpetually pleasant. He greets every morning with the same cheerful affect. He assists his neighbors, sometimes despite the cost to himself. He has maintained a friendship with Homer, or something that functions like friendship across decades, during which Homer has done things that would sever most human relationships permanently. The show presents Ned as the moral counterweight to Homer. Homer is the id, selfish, impulsive, needy, inconsistent. Ned is the superego disciplined, giving, controlled. But there is an episode that changes everything about how Ned reads. And once you've seen it, you can't go back. In the Season 8 episode, Hurricane Neddy, a hurricane destroys Ned's house. The community rallies to rebuild it, a heartwarming collective effort that goes badly wrong because the residents, despite their enthusiasm, are not construction professionals and build something structurally unsound. The rebuilt house collapses immediately. Standing in the rubble of his home, watching everything crumble, Ned finally breaks. He screams at the town. He insults specific people by name. He says things, accurate things, observed things, things he has clearly been carrying for a very long time with a precision and specificity that is not the language of someone who has just lost their temper. It is the language of someone who has been cataloging grievances and swallowing them for years, and has finally, catastrophically, run out of the capacity to swallow anymore. He is committed to a psychiatric facility. In the facility, the backstory is revealed. Ned was not always like this. As a child, he was violent and uncontrollable, a feral kid, the show implies, with rage that his beatnik parents were entirely unequipped to manage. They took him to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist worked with Ned for years. Through behavioral conditioning described in the episode with enough detail to be recognizable, the aggression was not eliminated. It was suppressed. It was buried so deeply, surrounded by so many layers of behavioral programming, that it became inaccessible to the person it lived in. Ned's niceness is not a character trait. It is a cage built around a feral child by an adult who decided the cage was the solution. Everything about Ned reads differently after this reveal. His patience with Homer is not virtue. It is the result of a system that prevents him from expressing anything other than patience, regardless of what Homer does to him. He cannot be angry. He was trained not to be angry. The capacity to express that anger was removed from his behavioral repertoire by a treatment he underwent as a child without the ability to consent, without the ability to understand what was being done to him. His faith is not spiritual conviction in the simple sense. It is, at least in part, a framework that explains why he keeps suffering despite doing everything right. A framework that lets him reframe the losses and the disappointments and the grinding unfairness of his position without reaching the conclusion that would otherwise be inevitable, that the system is broken, that goodness is not rewarded, that his specific, careful, disciplined effort to be a good person has produced no observable return. His forgiveness of Homer after Maude's death is not grace. Maude Flanders was killed at a NASCAR event when Homer dodged the t-shirts being launched from a promotional cannon, and they struck Maude instead, knocking her from the bleachers to her death. Homer's selfishness, directly and causally, killed Ned's wife, and Ned forgave him. Fully, sincerely, without, as far as the show depicts, ever really confronting the thing that needed to be confronted, because the conditioning will not let him. The show is making a specific argument about Ned Flanders, and it's an argument that sits uncomfortably alongside the comedy. God talks to Homer multiple times across the show's history. Not figuratively, actually talks to him, face to face, recognizable as a divine interlocutor in extended conversations that affect the plot. Homer is, in some sense, a person to whom God speaks. God has never spoken to Ned. Ned prays. He attends church with genuine devotion. He has organized his entire life around his faith. He has sacrificed things, endured things, forgiven things that should be unforgivable, all in service of a religious commitment that he holds more consistently and more sincerely than any other character in Springfield. God talks to Homer. God ignores Ned. The drunk who falls asleep during the sermon gets the divine conversation. The most devout man in town gets silence. This is not a random creative choice. This is a thesis statement about how the universe of Springfield and, by implication, the universe the show is commenting on works. Goodness is not rewarded. Faithfulness is not answered. The system does not care about moral behavior. It cares about compliance. And both Homer and Ned are compliant. Homer through incapacity and damage, Ned through conditioning, but only Homer gets the grace because Homer is the show's protagonist and because the universe of Springfield has decided, for reasons that are never explained or justified, to favor him. Place Ned and Homer side by side and the show's actual argument comes into focus. Homer does everything wrong. He is selfish, negligent, often cruel in casual ways, repeatedly destructive of relationships and property and people's well-being. He causes damage, he fails at his responsibilities, he privileges his own comfort over virtually everything else. And he survives. He thrives. He is loved. He is employed. His family stays. He gets grace he doesn't earn. Ned does everything right. He is generous, disciplined, faithful, patient. He works hard. He raises his children carefully. He is the neighbor Homer could never be. He loses his wife. His house falls down. His business struggles. His prayers go unanswered. He breaks down and is institutionalized, and comes back from that too, still smiling, still waving from across the fence, still carrying 30 years of suppressed rage in a cage that was built into him before he was old enough to know what it meant. They live next door to each other. They have lived next door to each other for 36 years. The gap between them, between what their lives should look like if the universe cared about merit and what their lives actually look like, has never closed. It was never going to close. The system that Burns built, the system that Springfield maintains, the system that runs on denial and radiation, and the quiet machinery of power, that system has a use for Homer. Homer is the safety inspector who lets the violations continue. Homer is the worker whose incompetence is the plant's greatest asset. The system has no use for Ned. Ned can't be corrupted. Ned can't be pressured. Ned has no obvious lever that power can pull, and so the system simply doesn't reward him. It doesn't need to. Springfield keeps Homer at the plant and Ned at the church, and neither of them understands why their position is what it is, and neither of them is capable of doing anything about it, for reasons that are specific and different, but that arrive at the same result. The fence between their houses is the smallest possible physical expression of the largest possible distance. Ned has the better yard. Homer has the better life. That's Springfield. That's always been Springfield. Section 12. Everything connected the final reading. We have spent a long time in Springfield now, long enough to have walked its streets from multiple angles, long enough to have stood at the cooling towers and looked up, long enough to have sat in the hospital room in 1993, watching a man who may or may not have ever woken up, long enough to have reread the sundial in the town square, and felt the old certainty about who shot Mr. Burns begin to dissolve at the edges. Long enough maybe to have started to feel what the theories are each trying, in their individual ways, to communicate. That Springfield is not a place you can look at casually and understand. It demands a second look, a third look, the willingness to sit with contradiction and ask what it means. Let's bring the threads together, because they have been pulling in the same direction this whole time. The contamination theory says there is a physical cause for everything wrong in Springfield. A substance, leaking from a specific source, has been altering the residents of this town at the cellular level for decades. The yellow skin, the mutations, the impaired cognition, the arrested aging, all of it traces to the cooling towers on the edge of town, to the cracked pipes and inadequate containment, and the 342 violations that nobody with the power to fix them has ever chosen to fix. The coma theory says, there is a perceptual frame around everything that happens in Springfield. A man is unconscious in a hospital bed, and what we are watching is the interior landscape of his mind, a dream maintained by love, by the refusal to let go of the family he went under holding. The surrealism of the later seasons, the impossibility of the plots, the frozen ages of everyone he loves, these are the products of a mind that is too damaged to be consistent and too devoted to stop. The denial theory says, there is a social mechanism in Springfield that enforces its own reality against any competing truth. The town knows things it has decided not to know. It has made laws against remembering. It has built its identity around the active suppression of inconvenient fact, and it has done this for so long that the suppression has become the culture, indistinguishable from normalcy. The Burns immortality theory says, there is a power at the center of everything in Springfield that predates the show itself, predates its audience, predates most of the institutions around it. A man who should be dead, who has been technically dying for a century, sustained by the same substance that poisons the town around him. He is the system. He is the cause. He is the reason the contamination continues, the reason the violations are never fixed, the reason Homer keeps his job and Mona stayed gone and Ned's prayers go unanswered. The predictions theory says, Springfield is a mirror. The show has been holding it up for 36 years, and the reflection it shows is not a fantasy of America, it's a diagnosis of America. The corrupt billionaire, the captured government, the contaminated environment, the amnesiac population, the honest people removed from the community, the dishonest ones protected by it. None of this was invented for entertainment. It was observed. And the observations were accurate enough, and the show ran long enough, that reality kept catching up to the satire. Here is what all 5 theories are saying simultaneously, in their different languages. Something is wrong in Springfield. Not accidentally wrong, structurally wrong, deliberately maintained. And the people who suffer most from it are the ones who cannot see it because the thing that makes them unable to see it is itself a product of the wrongness. Homer cannot understand what Burns has done to his family because the contamination and the crayon and the accumulated damage of being Homer Simpson in Springfield have made him cognitively incapable of holding the connections. Ned cannot act on what he sees clearly because the conditioning removed his capacity for action before he was old enough to choose whether to have it. Lisa can see everything. She is the one character who can see everything, and she is 8 years old. And the world around her is so thoroughly shaped by forces she cannot individually overcome that her clarity produces mostly loneliness. Maggie can see everything too, and she is choosing, deliberately and with full awareness, to wait. Let's talk about Lisa for a moment longer, because Lisa is the character the show has been most honest about. Lisa Simpson is the moral center of The Simpsons in the truest sense, not the character with the best values, though her values are among the show's most carefully considered, but the character who actually looks at Springfield and asks the questions that need to be asked. She is 8 years old. She has been 8 years old for 36 years. She is brilliant and isolated, and she keeps fighting for things the town doesn't want fought for, keeps raising issues the community has agreed to suppress, keeps being the voice that nobody wants to listen to in a room full of people who've decided that not listening is safer. The show does not reward Lisa. It does not protect Lisa. It depicts with uncomfortable consistency what it looks like to be the smartest and most morally serious person in a community that has decided those qualities are inconvenient. She keeps going anyway. In the context of all the theories, the coma and the contamination and the denial and the immortality and the predictions, Lisa is the one character whose existence can't be explained away. She is not a product of Burns's design. She is not comfortable with the stasis. She does not participate in the forgetting. She is, in the deepest reading of the show, the reason the show has a moral conscience at all. Homer's dream, if the coma theory is right, gave him the family he loved most. Marge, steady and present. Bart, mischievous and alive. Maggie, extraordinary and safe. And Lisa, brilliant, difficult, honest, alone who the dream gave him, because some part of Homer, even in his coma, knew that his family needed someone who could see clearly. Someone who could keep asking the questions the town had made illegal. Someone who would not participate in the forgetting, even when participating would have been so much easier. Homer gave himself a daughter who would not be silent. In the dream, as in the world, that's the most loving thing he could have done. The loop. Every theory we've discussed ends at the same place, the loop. The self-sustaining, self-maintaining cycle that Springfield exists inside. The town that resets. The family that never ages. The catastrophes that are forgotten by morning. The same couch, the same house, the same faces. The loop is real. Whether it's maintained by radiation, or by dreams, or by collective denial, or by the machinery of Burns' empire, or by the audience's own refusal to let the characters change, it's real, and it has been running for 36 years. And it will keep running as long as the show runs, which is as long as we keep watching. Here is the question the loop raises, which none of the theories fully answers. Is the loop a prison or a sanctuary? The coma theory wants it to be a sanctuary. Homer's dream is not a nightmare. It's the only heaven a man like Homer Simpson would ever build for himself. His family, preserved and intact, on the couch, forever. The loop is love made permanent. The contamination theory wants it to be a prison. The residents of Springfield cannot escape the loop because the same substance that built the loop has taken from them the cognitive capacity to recognize it as a loop. They are trapped inside something they cannot see. The denial theory says, it's both. The residents know, on some level, that they are inside the loop. They have seen the machinery that maintains it, the vote, the decree, the exile of anyone who refuses to participate, and they choose it anyway. Because the alternative is worse. Because looking clearly at Springfield, at the contamination, at the dead mother, at the three-eyed fish, at the billionaire who has been running the same exploitation for over a century, is more painful than staying inside the comfortable unreality of what they have. The loop is not forced on them. They built it. They maintain it. They vote for it, unanimously, every time. And we vote for it too. This is the final thing the show is saying, and it is the most honest thing, and it is addressed directly at the audience. We have been watching The Simpsons for 36 years. Many of us have been watching it our whole lives. We have absorbed its rhythms, its visual language, its moral framework, its specific way of looking at American life. We have laughed at Homer and worried about Lisa, and occasionally noticed Maggie's eyes tracking something just outside the frame. We have not, for the most part, asked why everyone is yellow. We accepted the show's stasis because we needed it. Because The Simpsons frozen in time are also something in us frozen in time, the child who first laughed at a cartoon family and found in it a reflection of something they recognized. The house on Evergreen Terrace is everyone's house, in the specific way that only the best fiction achieves. You can feel the carpet under your feet. You know which stair creaks. You know where Homer keeps the remote. Letting The Simpsons age and change and move on would mean letting that recognition age and change and move on with them. It would mean acknowledging that the version of yourself who first watched this show is already gone changed by time in all the ways the characters haven't been, so we hold them in place. We keep the loop running. We tune in every week and find everything exactly as we left it, and we feel something that isn't quite comfort but is the closest to it that this particular kind of fiction can provide. That is The Simpsons. 36 years. Nearly 800 episodes. The most analyzed, most theorized, most deeply examined piece of popular fiction in the history of American television. A man who may be dreaming of his family from a hospital bed. A town built on contaminated ground that has forgotten it is contaminated. A billionaire kept alive by the same force that poisoned the water supply. A baby with a plan that nobody suspects because she designed it that way. A woman exiled by the same man her son would spend his life working for. A principal who is an imposter, and a town that voted to make the lie the law. A neighbor whose goodness is a cage, and a neighbor whose badness is protected by the system. And in the middle of all of it, a family on a couch, together, home. The loop runs because we run it. Homer falls through the door at 5:30 and says something that makes Marge sigh, and Bart laugh and Lisa close her book and look up. Maggie watches from the high chair. The credits roll, the couch gag plays. Something impossible and hilarious happens in the living room. And outside, just visible through the window if you tilt your head at the right angle, the cooling towers stand against the sky, leaking quietly. As they always have, as they always will, thank you for spending this time in Springfield. If you fell asleep somewhere back around Burns's immortality, that's the correct response. If you're still here, if you've followed every thread, held every theory, sat with every dark reading of a show you grew up loving, then you have done something that the residents of Springfield never quite manage. You looked. Not just at the jokes, not just at the couch gag, not just at the yellow skin that everyone accepts without question. You looked underneath. You asked why the fish has 3 eyes. You sat with the implications of a mother who kissed her sleeping son goodbye and vanished into the night. You took seriously the possibility that every episode since 1993 has been the dream of a man who never woke up. You did what Lisa Simpson does. You kept asking the questions that Springfield made illegal. And now you know what's down there, under the jokes, under the resets, under the loop. A family. A damaged, strange, impossible, extraordinary family. Loving each other as imperfectly and as completely as they know how. On a couch, in a contaminated town, in a dream inside a coma, inside an America that has been staring at its own reflection for 36 years and only sometimes recognizing what it sees, close your eyes now. The loop is still running. Springfield is still there. Homer is still on the couch. And somewhere, in a river near a cracked cooling tower, a fish with 3 eyes is swimming in slow circles under a yellow sky. Good night. Part 2. Deeper into Springfield. Extended explorations, additional theories, and the stories the show never finished. Extended, the plant in detail, a fuller accounting of the contamination. We have already established the broad outlines of the contamination theory. Makes market, the cracked cooling towers, the luminous waste, the 3-eyed fish, the yellow skin. But the theory rewards a closer examination, a more careful cataloging of what the show has actually shown us about the plant and its relationship to the town, because the detail is where the theory finds its teeth. Let's begin with the physical structure of the plant itself. The Springfield nuclear power plant is, in the show's canon, a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. This is a specific type of nuclear reactor, one in which water is used as both a coolant and a moderator, circulating through the reactor core at high pressure, transferring heat to a secondary circuit that drives the steam turbines. Pressurized water reactors are, in the real world, among the most common types of nuclear power plant in operation. They are also, when properly maintained, among the safest. The operative phrase is, when properly maintained. The Springfield plant has 342 documented safety violations. This number appears in the episode Homer's Odyssey, in the context of a safety inspection, and it is presented as a fact of the plant's operating history rather than a sudden discovery. 342 violations means that the problems are not new, they are accumulated. They represent years, possibly decades of failed maintenance, ignored warnings, deferred repairs, and the kind of institutional negligence that only persists when the person at the top has decided that the cost of fixing things is higher than the cost of leaving them broken. What does 342 violations look like in practice? The show has been remarkably specific about this over the years. Coolant pipes wrapped in what appears to be standard household duct tape, radiation warning signs that have faded to illegibility, emergency protocols that nobody has reviewed since the facility opened. A control room in which several of the monitoring instruments appear to be non-functional, their readings replaced by handwritten notes reading fine or probably fine. A cooling pond that, in at least one episode, is visibly luminous, the water itself glowing with a faint but unmistakable light that radiation detection equipment would presumably find alarming. The show also depicts the plant's waste disposal practices with a consistency that, across multiple episodes, adds up to a portrait of systematic environmental contamination. Radioactive waste is stored in containers that are then deposited in local bodies of water. In one of the show's most casually horrifying moments, Homer disposes of a waste container by throwing it out his car window on the way home from work. The container rolls down an embankment and comes to rest in what appears to be a residential area. This is played as a joke. The background music is cheerful. Homer doesn't look back. But the waste landed somewhere. It is, in the logic of the show's universe, sitting in someone's neighborhood right now, leaking into the soil, finding the water table, making its way through the ground toward wherever the groundwater eventually goes. In Springfield, it goes to the river that Blinky swims in. The plant's workforce tells its own story. Homer Simpson is the safety inspector. We have established what this means in terms of his qualifications and his cognitive limitations. But it's worth dwelling on the specific nature of his role, because safety inspector at a nuclear facility is not a trivial position. It is the role whose entire purpose is to identify and flag exactly the kind of violations that the Springfield plant has accumulated. A competent safety inspector at a facility like this would have protocols, checklists, documentation requirements, regular reports filed with regulatory authorities, an ongoing relationship with the relevant federal and state oversight bodies that have jurisdiction over nuclear facilities. The safety inspector is the human interface between the plant's actual operating conditions and the broader regulatory framework that is supposed to ensure those conditions don't endanger the surrounding population. Homer's version of this role involves falling asleep at his monitoring station, eating at his console, and on at least one documented occasion, using a piece of monitoring equipment as a surface on which to rest his feet while watching television on a small portable screen that he has somehow installed at his workstation. The contrast between what the role requires and what Homer provides is so total that it ceases to be funny and starts to be a policy analysis. The plant is not accidentally unsupervised. It is structurally unsupervised. The position of safety inspector has been filled by a person whose profile is specifically incompatible with doing the job, and he has been in that position for the entire run of the show. When German investors briefly acquired the plant in one episode, the first thing they did was fire Homer. Within days of his departure, they had identified the scope of the plant's violations and nearly bankrupted their investment trying to understand how to address them. When Burns bought the plant back, he rehired Homer immediately. This is the clearest statement the show makes about the strategic function of Homer's incompetence. The Germans understood what Homer refused to see. Burns understood that this meant they had to go. Let's spend time with what the plant has done to the town's wildlife, because the contamination theory's foundation rests on a chain of evidence that runs from the fish to the animals to the people, and each link in that chain strengthens the ones on either side. Blinky the three-eyed fish appears in Season 2 and returns periodically. The show treats his existence as an established fact of Springfield's ecology. He is an identifiable individual creature living in the river near the plant, who is known by name. The mutation is stable. It has persisted across multiple episodes, multiple seasons, multiple years. This is not a random genetic aberration. This is an environmental effect that has produced a stable and apparently heritable mutation in a local fish population. The three eyes are the most visible symptom. They are presumably not the only symptom. Fish populations under environmental pressure from contamination typically display a range of mutations, some visible, some not. Reproductive irregularities, behavioral changes, unusual disease susceptibility or resistance. The fish that Springfield is drawing its water from and eating its fish from are fish that have been living in radiated water for decades, and Blinky's three eyes are merely the mutation that happens to be legible from outside. The show has also depicted other animals in and around Springfield with characteristics that, in the context of the contamination theory, deserve closer attention. The Simpson family dog, Santa's little helper, is a greyhound who has lived his entire life in Springfield. Several episodes have depicted him with behavioral traits and health conditions that are at minimum unusual. The show plays these as animal comedy, but the pattern of unusual biology in Springfield's animal population is consistent with what you would expect in a community with the plant's documented contamination record. There are wild animals in the woods outside Springfield that are depicted across various episodes with characteristics suggesting mutation, enlarged features, unusual coloration, behavior that doesn't correspond to what you'd expect from the species in question. The forest outside town is not the forest of a healthy ecosystem. It is the forest of an ecosystem that has been under pressure for a long time. And then there are the residents. The yellow skin deserves a more careful examination than the casual mention it typically receives in discussions of the theory. The specific yellow of the Simpsons characters and of every Springfield resident and of the family pets, but crucially not of visitors from outside Springfield, who are depicted with more naturalistic skin tones, is a very specific color. It is the yellow of elevated bilirubin. It is the yellow of liver stress. The liver processes toxins. It filters the blood. It breaks down the products of cellular metabolism and prepares them for excretion. When the liver is under severe, chronic stress, when it is dealing with a constant load of something it cannot adequately process, it begins to fail at its secondary functions. Bilirubin accumulates in the tissue. The skin yellows. The jaundice of liver failure is yellow. The jaundice of newborn infants processing their first days of extrauterine life is yellow. The jaundice produced by biliary obstruction, by hepatitis, by toxic exposure, yellow. Every Springfield resident has this yellow. Every person who drinks the water, breathes the air, eats the fish from the river, and visitors who have not been exposed to what produces this yellow do not have it. The art direction of the show has always framed this as stylistic, a creative choice, the distinctive look of the Simpsons universe. The contamination theory frames it as diagnostic. One of the most significant pieces of evidence for the contamination theory is something the show has embedded so naturally into its world that most viewers never register it as significant at all. Springfield has a hospital. Springfield has doctors. Springfield's medical infrastructure is, by the standards the show has established, broadly functional. The kind of local hospital and general practitioner network you'd expect in a mid-sized American town. And not one of Springfield's medical professionals has ever raised the question. Not one has ever published a study on the unusual skin pigmentation shared by every patient they treat. Not one has ever presented the elevated mutation rates, the blinkies, the four-fingered hands, the biological characteristics that deviate from any baseline human physiology to a peer-reviewed journal or a federal health authority. Not one has ever sent a letter to the state health department noting that the population around the Springfield nuclear power plant displays a constellation of symptoms consistent with chronic radiation exposure. The denial theory says this is the social mechanism in action. The medical establishment, like every other Springfield institution, has chosen to participate in the forgetting. The doctors are as contaminated as their patients. They see the same yellow in the mirror. They drink the same water. They are inside the same loop. The contamination theory says something slightly different. The doctors can't see it because their own cognitive function has been compromised by the same exposure. They are looking at a diagnostic picture that should be obvious, but the capacity to connect those dots has been eroded by decades of living in the same contaminated environment they are supposed to be monitoring. In both readings, the result is the same. The doctors don't raise the question because they can't, or because they've decided not to, or because the two are, at this point, indistinguishable. The plant keeps running. The violations stay at 342. Homer stays asleep at his console, and Springfield stays yellow. Extended. The coma in detail mapping the dream. The coma theory rests on a specific event, the Season 4 episode, in which Homer flatlines, but its implications extend backward through earlier seasons and forward through everything that came after. To fully appreciate the theory, it helps to map the dream more carefully, to look at the specific features of the post-coma show and ask, what does this look like if we take the theory seriously? The first thing to notice is the texture of the dream's early stages. In the episodes immediately following the coma episode, in the back half of Season 4 and through Season 5, the show is still relatively grounded. Homer's adventures are more elaborate than the earliest seasons, but they haven't yet reached the full surrealism of the middle and later years. The theory's explanation for this is the same explanation neurologists would give for the early stages of a medically induced coma. The brain is still close to the surface. The dream still has most of its architecture intact. The normal rules are still largely in force, even if they're beginning to flex at the edges. As the seasons progress, as the coma deepens, the rules flex further. Season 7 through Season 12 represents what the theory considers the dream's middle period, elaborate, creative, increasingly detached from the kind of domestic realism that grounded the early show, but still emotionally coherent in the ways that good dreams are. The plots are wild. The guest appearances proliferate. Homer goes to space. Homer discovers a secret society. Homer meets multiple presidents. But the emotional core Homer's relationship with his family, his need to be loved, his terror of being left remains legible. The dream still knows what it cares about. The later seasons, from roughly season 13 onward, represent the coma theory's third phase, the deep dream, in which the brain's ability to maintain a coherent internal logic is significantly degraded. The plots become increasingly arbitrary. The character motivations become inconsistent in ways that feel less like creative choices and more like the kind of drift you get when the organizing intelligence behind a dream is losing its grip. The emotional core is still there, in flashes, but it's harder to find. The dream is still running, but the dreamer is running out of the resources to run it well. This maps, with uncomfortable precision, onto the widely observed quality decline of the show across its later seasons. Let's examine the emotional architecture of the dream more carefully. Homer's coma, in the theory's reading, is not random. The brain does not dream randomly. It dreams according to its preoccupations, its fears, its desires, its unresolved questions. Homer's dream, the entirety of The Simpsons from 1993 onward, is structured around the things Homer cares most about, in order. His wife? Marge is the dream's stabilizing element. She is always there, she is always patient, even when she is frustrated. She is always present in the house, always accessible, always the anchor to which the dream can return when it has run out into more turbulent territory and needs to find its footing again. The coma theory argues that Marge's consistent, stabilizing presence across 30-something years of increasingly chaotic episodes is not a character trait but a necessity. She is what the dreaming mind holds on to. She is what Homer's brain comes back to when the other elements of the dream become too unstable to sustain. There are episodes in which Homer and Marge's marriage is under serious stress, episodes in which Marge considers leaving, or in which Homer has done something so damaging to the relationship that a real marriage would struggle to survive it. These episodes always end with reconciliation. Always. Every time the dream pushes the marriage to the edge of dissolution, it pulls back. The marriage holds, because the marriage has to hold. If the dream allows the marriage to end, if Homer's unconscious mind generates a version of his life in which Marge is gone, then the dream has produced the thing it was designed to avoid. The dreamer cannot be allowed to reach that outcome, because that outcome is, in a specific and terrible sense, what is actually happening in the hospital room. Marge is somewhere out there, in the real world, without Homer, and the dream will not depict this. It cannot. Homer's children in the dream follow a different emotional logic, but no less compelling a one. Bart exists in the dream as the son Homer is always chasing, always trying to connect with, always slightly out of reach. Their relationship is defined by an affection that struggles to find its expression. Homer strangles Bart. Bart pranks Homer. They fight, they reconcile, they misunderstand each other in ways that are funny and sometimes heartbreaking. The dream never quite resolves this relationship because the theory suggests Homer's unconscious mind knows that the relationship was unresolved when he went under. He hadn't yet found the language for what he felt about his son. The dream runs the scene over and over, trying different approaches, never quite landing on the version that feels like enough. Lisa is the dream's conscience. She is what Homer's unconscious mind reaches for when it needs to process a moral question, the presence in the dream that asks the questions Homer can't quite articulate for himself. Her isolation, her difficulty, her recurring cycles of hope and disappointment are painful to watch, and the theory argues that this pain is intentional. Homer's mind knows that Lisa sees too clearly. It knows that the dream's integrity depends on nobody looking too closely at what's holding it together. Lisa keeps looking anyway. The dream can't stop her. She is, in some sense, the dreamer's own intelligence turned back on itself, the part of his mind that knows what's happening but cannot wake him up. Maggie is the most interesting case in the coma framework. She is the child he knew least the baby, the one whose personality was still forming, the one he had the least specific mental image of when he went under. And so, the dream does what dreams do when they encounter a gap in their reference material. It fills the gap with something extraordinary. Maggie in the dream is capable of things no real baby could do because Homer's mind, confronted with the blankness of his knowledge of her, projects his best possible hope onto that blankness. She is what he dreams she could be. She is his prayer. There is a specific quality of the coma theory that elevates it above most fan theories. It makes the bad episodes meaningful. When The Simpsons produces an episode that is generally considered poor, inconsistent characterization, a plot that doesn't make sense, jokes that don't land, an ending that feels forced or arbitrary, the standard analysis is creative exhaustion, or the difficulty of sustaining quality over hundreds of episodes, or the inevitable decay of a show that has been on the air too long. The coma theory offers a different analysis. The bad episodes are the dream slipping. They are the moments when the dreaming brain has run out of the resources it needs to maintain coherence. The characters behave unlike themselves because Homer's memory of who they are is degrading. The plots resolve arbitrarily because the organizing intelligence behind the dream is losing its grip on narrative logic. The emotional beats ring hollow because the dreamer is further from the surface, further from the emotional material that gave the earlier episodes their resonance. Under this reading, even the worst episodes of The Simpsons become a kind of data. They chart the deterioration. They mark the progress of something that, if the coma theory is correct, is moving in only one direction. The dream is getting harder to maintain. The brain is working harder to sustain it. The episodes become more elaborate and less coherent, simultaneously more extravagant in their conceits, because the mind is compensating for the loss of the quieter, more grounded material it can no longer access. Less emotionally true, because the emotional truth requires a proximity to the dreamer's actual experience, that the deepening coma is progressively removing. This is the reading that haunts you after the theory settles in. It is possible to watch the later seasons of The Simpsons as a gradual farewell, the dream's slow erosion, the dreamer's increasing distance from the surface, the family on the couch getting harder and harder to see clearly. Homer is still on the couch. He will always be on the couch, but the dream is working harder to keep him there. Extended, the Burns Empire: How One Man Owns a Town. We have discussed Burns' immortality, the mechanism that keeps him alive, the role of Smithers in managing that mechanism. But the full scope of what Burns has built in Springfield, the architecture of his control over the town, deserves its own careful examination, because the immortality theory is only coherent if you understand what Burns is using his long life to accomplish. Burns owns the nuclear power plant. This is the foundation. Everything else rests on it. But the plant is not just an energy facility. It is the engine of an economic dependency that makes Springfield's entire existence contingent on Burns' continued operation. The plant is the largest employer in Springfield. It drives the local economy in ways that extend far beyond direct employment. The businesses that serve its workers, the tax revenue it generates, the infrastructure it has funded directly and indirectly. Remove the plant from Springfield and you remove the economic basis of the town's existence. Burns knows this. He has always known this. The plant's indispensability to Springfield is not an incidental feature of the local economy, it is a strategic achievement. Burns structured the plant's relationship to the town specifically to create this dependency, because dependency is control. The control extends beyond economics. Burns owns the local newspaper at various points in the show's history. He has owned the local television station. He has run, or had significant influence over, candidates for every major elected office in Springfield at various times across the show's run. He has directed the local police through a combination of implicit influence and explicit instruction. He has had specific residents investigated, surveilled, or pressured when they showed signs of becoming inconvenient to his interests. The case of Mona Simpson is the clearest example. Burns identified a private citizen as a threat to his biological weapons program. He reported her to federal authorities. He maintained a personal interest in her prosecution across decades. He spotted her in a taxicab 27 years after the initial incident and called the FBI with her location. He continued to exercise the full weight of his connections and resources against one woman for 27 years because she had destroyed property he considered his. This is not the behavior of a businessman protecting his interests. This is the behavior of a feudal lord who has confused his property with his identity and pursues anyone who threatens it, with the implacability of someone who has enough resources to pursue indefinitely and enough time in Burns' case, literally enough time to wait. The deal with Abe Simpson sits at the intersection of several of the theories we've examined, and it's worth dwelling on at length because it is the clearest illustration of how Burns operates at the individual level. At some point before the show's timeline, the show is deliberately vague about exactly when Burns committed a crime in which Abe Simpson was a witness. The crime is never fully specified. It is presented as something serious enough to give Abe leverage, but we are not told what it was. Abe, rather than going to authorities or using his knowledge publicly, negotiated a private deal. Burns would guarantee Homer permanent employment at the plant, regardless of performance or circumstance, in exchange for Abe's silence. Consider what this deal actually is. Abe traded his knowledge of a crime for his son's job security. He chose private accommodation over public accountability. He chose to keep the secret and take the benefit, rather than expose the crime and accept whatever consequences would follow. This is entirely consistent with everything the denial theory has established about how Springfield operates. Abe did what Springfield does. He voted to maintain the lie. He made the calculation that the comfortable private arrangement was preferable to the uncomfortable public truth, and the consequences of that calculation shaped Homer's entire life. Homer has permanent job security not because he is valued, not because he has performed well, not because Burns has any positive feeling toward him whatsoever, but because his father made a deal. Homer is, in the most literal sense, the human currency of a transaction he knows nothing about, a transaction that was executed before he was old enough to participate in it by a man who loved him and chose to protect him, and in doing so became complicit in the system that would damage him. Abe's protection of Homer is, simultaneously, Abe's participation in Burns' ongoing control of the town. The biological weapons laboratory adds a dimension to Burns' portrait that the show introduces and then largely doesn't pursue, which is itself significant. Burns manufactured biological weapons in Springfield, alongside the nuclear facility he also owned. He was simultaneously the man responsible for the most significant conventional industrial hazard in the town's history and the operator of a facility designed to produce mass casualty pathogens. This is not a background detail. This is a revelation that, if it were applied to a real-world scenario, would represent one of the most significant revelations about an individual's conduct imaginable, and the show drops it in one episode and moves on. The denial theory's explanation: the revelation exists in the canon of the show, but Springfield's collective amnesia applies here as it does everywhere else. Mona's raid destroyed the germs. The facility was presumably decommissioned or concealed or simply forgotten. The town knows, in the way it knows everything inconvenient, which is to say, it knew and then decided not to know. The contamination theory notes that the biological weapons facility, combined with the nuclear facility, means that Springfield has been subject to two distinct categories of industrial hazard for the duration of its existence as a community. The synergistic effects of living in proximity to both nuclear contamination and whatever the germ warfare lab may have contributed to the local environment have never been studied, because nobody in Springfield studies the things that would be dangerous to study. But Burns knew. Burns has always known. He is the only person in Springfield who has the full picture, who understands the complete scope of what he has done to this town, what he is doing to this town, what the town will look like in another 50 years if nothing changes. And nothing will change, because nothing in Springfield changes, because the loop runs, because the vote is always unanimous, because the real Skinner is always on the train. Burns sits at the top of all of it, older than anyone else in Springfield, older than most American institutions, sustained by the same invisible force that is slowly altering everyone around him, pressing his fingertips together in his tower at the edge of town. He has what he wants. He has always had what he wants. Excellent. Extended, the marriage of Homer and Marge. What holds and what doesn't. There is an argument to be made that the most interesting long-running story in The Simpsons is not the Burns conspiracy or the contamination or even the question of who shot the most powerful man in town. The most interesting story is the marriage. Homer and Marge have been married for over 36 years of broadcast time. They have been through things that would end most marriages, and would end virtually all fictional marriages that tried to depict the same level of sustained domestic turbulence. Homer has caused disasters. Homer has been thoughtless, occasionally cruel in his thoughtlessness, sometimes deliberately selfish, in ways that strain the plausible limits of Marge's famous patience. And the marriage holds. The contamination theory has a reading of this. Both Homer and Marge have been cognitively altered by their environment in ways that make the marriage's stability less surprising than it might otherwise be. Marge's extraordinary patience, which viewers have sometimes found unrealistic, may not be a character trait. It may be a symptom. The same contamination that reduced Homer's capacity for critical thinking may have reduced Marge's capacity for the kind of accumulated resentment that, in a normal marriage, eventually reaches a tipping point. The coma theory's reading is even simpler and more devastating. Marge doesn't leave because Homer won't dream her leaving. She is the anchor. She is the thing the dreaming mind holds on to when everything else becomes too unstable. In the dream, Marge always forgives him. In the dream, Marge always stays. Because the alternative is the thing the dream cannot afford to produce. But there is a third reading that has nothing to do with contamination or dreams, and it is the one the show has been most consistently, if quietly, making. Marge sees Homer clearly. She has always seen Homer clearly. She knows what he is: not a capable man who fails to apply his abilities, but a genuinely limited man who is doing his actual best with what he actually has. She knows about the damage. She may not know its cause, but she recognizes it. She has built her marriage on a clear-eyed understanding of who Homer actually is, rather than who she might wish he were, and that understanding, that refusal to require Homer to be something he cannot be, is the thing that makes the marriage survivable. The show has depicted this specifically in the episodes that flash back to how Homer and Marge met. Whatever the floating timeline has done to the era of their courtship, the emotional core of those stories is consistent. Marge saw something in Homer that others dismissed or ignored. She saw the love underneath the buffoonery, the genuine feeling underneath the surface: incompetence. She chose him with her eyes open, and she has kept choosing him, and the choice is, on some level, genuinely heroic. Homer's marriage is, in the contamination theory, the one relationship in Springfield that the contamination has not broken. It has affected both parties, but it has not broken the thing between them. That is either the show's most romantic statement or its most melancholy one, depending on how you hold it. Extended. Bart Simpson, the rebel as symptom. We have spent considerable time with Homer, Lisa, and Maggie. We have not spent enough time with Bart. Bart Simpson is the character who made the show famous. He was the cultural phenomenon of the early 90s. The t-shirts, the phrases, the moral panic from parent groups and school boards, the sense that here was a character who represented something new and slightly threatening about where popular culture was going. "Don't have a cow, man," entered the language. His face went on skateboards and lunchboxes. He was the first thing most people mentioned when The Simpsons was discussed. And then, gradually, the show moved past him. Lisa became the critical favorite. Homer became the emotional center. The show's intellectual weight migrated away from the kid who had launched it. But Bart, examined through the lens of the theories, is at least as interesting as anyone else in Springfield. And the story the show tells about him, the story it doesn't quite say out loud, is one of the most specifically painful things in the entire series. Bart Simpson is failing school. This is a premise the show has carried since its first episode, but it bears examination because Bart's academic failure is not the failure of a stupid child. Bart is not stupid. The show has depicted him, in contexts outside the structured environment of formal education, as creative, strategically intelligent, capable of elaborate long-term planning, with excellent social intelligence and an intuitive grasp of cause and effect that he consistently fails to deploy in classroom settings. What Bart lacks is not intelligence. What Bart lacks is engagement. The contamination theory notes that Bart, like every other child raised in Springfield, has been drinking the water and breathing the air for his entire life. The cognitive effects that the theory identifies in Homer, the foggy thinking, the impaired connection-making, the difficulty sustaining attention on things that feel boring or irrelevant, would plausibly manifest differently in a child than in an adult, because a child's developing brain is more plastic, more responsive to environmental influence, more capable of adapting to damage in ways that look less like impairment and more like a specific cognitive profile. Bart's intelligence is selective and context-dependent. He can plan a complicated prank across multiple days with elaborate contingencies. He cannot focus on a worksheet for 20 minutes. He can read a social situation with extraordinary precision. He cannot read the text assigned for homework. This is a recognized pattern in neurodevelopmental conditions that are associated with, among other things, early exposure to environmental toxins. The brain didn't fail to develop. It developed differently, in response to pressures that shaped it in directions that don't match what the school system is designed to reward. Bart's failure in school is, in the contamination reading, a symptom of what Springfield did to him before he was old enough to know what was happening. The relationship between Bart and Homer is the most emotionally complex relationship in the show, and it is defined almost entirely by the failure to communicate. Homer loves Bart. This is not in question. The show has depicted Homer's love for his son in moments that cut through all the comedy and all the strangulation gags and all the accumulated disappointment to something genuine and aching. There are episodes in which Homer's fear of losing Bart, his terror that his son doesn't know how much he's loved, produces some of the show's most powerful moments. But Homer cannot tell Bart what he needs to tell him. He tries and tries again and fails differently. He expresses love through action and then ruins the action through thoughtlessness. He reaches for connection and lands on correction. He means to say, "I love you," and says, "Why can't you be more like your sister?" The contamination theory offers a specific explanation for this communication failure. Homer's cognitive limitations are not evenly distributed across all domains. He retains emotional intelligence in certain respects, he feels deeply, he recognizes love, he wants desperately to be close to the people he loves. What he lacks is the executive function to translate that emotional intelligence into appropriate, effective action. He knows what he wants to say. He does not have reliable access to the cognitive mechanism that converts the knowing into the saying. This is not Homer failing. This is Homer operating at the ceiling of what the contamination has left him capable of. And Bart, watching his father reach for connection and miss, again and again, has developed his own way of holding this. He keeps some emotional distance. He maintains a layer of irony, of detachment, of the kind of armor that kids develop when love from a parent is real but unreliable in its expression. He loves Homer back with the same intensity and the same inability to fully express it. Father and son, separated by the same damage, reaching for each other across the same gap. Every strangling gag, read this way, is a tragedy. Homer grabbing Bart because he cannot say what he means. Bart provoking Homer because provocation is a form of contact, and he will take contact in whatever form he can get it. Bart's relationship with his own future is one of the show's most quietly devastating threads. The show has depicted Bart's likely adult trajectory in several flash-forward episodes, and the picture is not encouraging. Adult Bart tends to be depicted as someone who never quite found his footing, who has the same charm and the same charisma and the same ineffable Bartness that he had at 10, but who is operating in a world that has long since moved on from the things those qualities were good for. He is funny and clever and still likable. He is also, in most of these future visions, struggling. Not catastrophically, Bart tends to land on his feet, at least temporarily, but without the kind of stable foundation that would let you say he's going to be okay. The contamination theory's extension of this, whatever the radiation did to Bart's developing brain, also shaped the ceiling of what Bart can sustain. He can get by. He cannot build. He can survive the short term with creativity and charm. He cannot plan a long-term future because the cognitive hardware for that kind of planning, for the kind of deferred gratification, sustained focus, long horizon thinking that building a stable adult life requires, was compromised by the same environmental exposure that compromised Homer. Bart is Homer's son in more ways than DNA. He is his father's inheritance, including the inheritance of damage. And yet Bart resists. This is what makes him interesting even in the contamination framework. He is the most actively resistant character in the show's main family. Where Homer absorbs and endures, where Marge sustains and holds, where Lisa argues from within the system, and Maggie waits with extraordinary patience, Bart pushes back. He breaks rules. He challenges authority. He insists on being himself in contexts that want him to be something else. He is expelled from things and returns. He fails and tries again. He is, in the show's own terms, incorrigible, a word that means not able to be corrected, which the show usually frames as a flaw, but which the contamination theory allows us to read as a survival mechanism. In a town designed to produce compliance, Bart's incorrigibility is his most important quality. He cannot be fully assimilated into the system that has assimilated everyone else. His resistance is not strategic, like Maggie's. It is instinctual. He resists because he cannot help it. And what looks like a character flaw is also the thing that keeps him from disappearing entirely into Springfield's machinery of forgetting and compliance. Bart is 10 years old. He will always be 10 years old. He is the show's emblem of permanent youth, permanent resistance, permanent refusal to become whatever the world keeps trying to make him into. In Springfield, that might be the most genuinely heroic thing anyone is doing. Extended. Lisa Simpson, The Weight of Clarity. If Bart's story is about resistance, Lisa's story is about what clarity costs. Lisa is the character the show has treated most honestly about the experience of being intelligent in an environment that doesn't value intelligence. She is brilliant and she is lonely, and the connection between those two facts is not incidental. The show has depicted this connection so consistently and so specifically that it reads less like a character trait and more like a social observation that the writers have been making carefully and persistently for over 3 decades. Being smart in Springfield is not an advantage, it is a burden. It puts you in conflict with the institutions around you, the school, which cannot accommodate her pace, the family, which doesn't know what to do with her, the community, which experiences her clarity as a form of judgment. She is right about things and she is punished for being right. She raises important questions and she is dismissed. She fights for causes that matter and she loses, repeatedly, because the causes that matter are precisely the causes that the system is designed to suppress. The contamination theory adds a specific layer to this. The radiation that diminished Homer's intelligence amplified Maggie's, we've argued. What did it do to Lisa? The theory's answer is complicated and a little dark. Lisa's intelligence may be, in part, a product of the same environmental forces that produce the other mutations in Springfield. She is not simply the smart child in a family of average people. She is, in the contamination framework, the child whose particular genetic profile responded to the radiation by producing a form of cognitive function that is sharper, more connective, more capable of seeing patterns than the baseline. If this is true, Lisa's intelligence is not just a gift. It is a mutation produced by the same substance that yellowed her skin and curved her eyes and gave her father a mind that can barely navigate its own day. She is Springfield's product as much as Homer is. She just came out differently. There is an argument that Lisa is the character through whom the show most directly addresses its own deepest questions. The contamination, the denial, the immortality, the conspiracy of the Mona storyline, these are things that Homer cannot understand, and Bart cannot be bothered with, and Maggie chooses not to reveal. But Lisa can see them. Lisa does see them. And the show keeps her at 8 years old, keeps her in Springfield Elementary, keeps her surrounded by people who won't listen, not out of cruelty, but out of structural necessity. Lisa's knowledge is the show's knowledge. The show knows everything we've been discussing tonight. It has been showing us these patterns, laying out this evidence, building this case across hundreds of episodes. Lisa is the character through whom the show speaks when it needs to say something true, and Springfield won't let her be heard. She is 8 years old. She has been 8 years old for 36 years. She has been saying the right thing for 36 years to a town that has been not listening for 36 years. Her persistence in this light is not just admirable. It is the show's moral center. Whatever else is wrong in Springfield, and we have cataloged, at some length, the many things that are wrong as long as Lisa keeps asking the questions, the show has not entirely given up. She is 8 years old, and she plays the saxophone, and she has not stopped looking. That, more than anything else, is why we keep watching. Extended, the secondary characters and what they represent. Springfield is a town, not just a family. And the supporting cast of characters who populate it are not background furniture. They are, collectively, a portrait of what contamination and denial and institutional capture do to an entire community. Each one carries, in miniature, one of the show's larger arguments. Chief Clancy Wiggum. Springfield's chief of police is, by any objective measure, incompetent. He is overweight, easily distracted, prone to misinterpreting evidence, slow to respond, quick to reach incorrect conclusions, and apparently unaware of or indifferent to the most basic requirements of his profession. In the Who Shot Mr. Burns investigation, he arrests the wrong person. His detective work consists primarily of looking at whatever is directly in front of him and deciding that it is probably the solution. The contamination theory notes that Wiggum is one of Springfield's lifelong residents, presumably exposed to the same environmental conditions as everyone else. His cognitive profile, the slowness, the inability to make connections across pieces of evidence, the cheerful incomprehension of his own limitations is consistent with the cognitive effects of chronic low-level radiation exposure. But there is a specific episode detail about Wiggum that the contamination theory finds particularly significant. In the episode depicting Mona Simpson's raid on Burns's biological weapons facility, the security guard whose asthma was accidentally cured by the raid's antibiotic bomb was a young Clancy Wiggum. Wiggum was there. He was present at the destruction of Burns' germ warfare facility. He inhaled the antibiotic agent, and then he went on to become the chief of police of the same town where the facility had operated, in the same town where Burns continued to run the plant that had been contaminating the water supply. He does not appear to remember this connection. He does not appear to have made any use of his presence at a historically significant event in Springfield's hidden history. He went to work for the police department and became, by long practice and perhaps by biological necessity, the kind of police chief who makes the 342 violations at the nuclear plant sustainable. The kind of police chief who doesn't ask questions that Burns doesn't want asked. The kind of police chief whose incompetence is, like Homer's, not a bug but a feature. Moe Sislak. Moe tends bar at Moe's Tavern, where Homer and his small circle of friends spend a significant portion of their time. He is miserable, bitter, and profoundly lonely. He has had romantic relationships that invariably end. He has attempted to improve his life in ways that invariably fail. He exists in a state of permanent low-grade suffering that the show plays for comedy, but that, on reflection, is one of the more accurately depicted portraits of a specific kind of chronic depression. Moe is not dumb. He is not incapable. In specific contexts, the show has depicted him as surprisingly competent, a thoughtful bartender, an unexpectedly skilled cook, a person of occasional genuine warmth. His limitations are not cognitive. They are emotional and circumstantial. He is a person whose life has not gone as he might have hoped, who is living in a town that has not provided him with the conditions for the life he might have had, and who has settled into his misery with the resignation of someone who has run out of reasons to fight it. The contamination theory reads Moe's specific flavor of hopelessness as a product of his environment. Not in the sense of cognitive impairment, Moe is smart enough to see his situation clearly, but in the sense that Springfield's contaminated, stagnant, denial-maintained environment has produced a specific kind of despair in residents who can see but cannot change. He sees it. He can't fix it. He pours another drink. Mayor Quimby. The mayor of Springfield is openly, cheerfully, almost defiantly corrupt. He awards city contracts to his relatives. He accepts bribes in open view. He makes political decisions based entirely on self-interest. He is completely unaccountable to the population he governs. He keeps getting re-elected. The denial theory's reading of Mayor Quimby is that he is not an anomaly in Springfield's political landscape. He is the political landscape. He is what you get when a community's capacity for civic accountability has been systematically eroded either by contamination that impairs critical thinking or by the social machinery of denial that makes it easier to accept the obvious corruption than to confront it. The residents of Springfield know Quimby is corrupt. They have seen the evidence. They re-elect him anyway, or allow him to operate without effective opposition, because challenging the corruption would require engaging with an institutional reality that Springfield has collectively decided is too dangerous to engage with. Quimby is sustained by the same force that sustains Burns, the same force that sent the real Seymour Skinner away on a train. The force of a community that has decided, consciously or not, that the lie is safer than the truth. Sideshow Bob Doctor. Robert Underdunk Terwilliger is the show's most intellectually complex villain and one of its most consistently interesting characters. He is a highly educated man with a genuine aesthetic sensibility, real cultural sophistication, and a specific, obsessive hatred of Bart Simpson that has led him to attempt Bart's murder on multiple occasions. He always fails. He always goes to prison. He always gets out. He always tries again. The Coma Theory's reading of Sideshow Bob is somewhat different from its readings of other characters. Bob is too specific, too consistently motivated, too clearly drawn to be a simple product of the dreaming mind-filling space, with a recurring antagonist. He feels, in the Coma framework, like something the dreaming mind is working through a figure who represents the sophisticated external world that Homer has always felt slightly inferior to, always slightly at odds with, always a little afraid of. Bob is what happens when intelligence is combined with bitterness in an environment that can't accommodate either. He is, in his own way, as trapped in Springfield's loop as everyone else. He returns again and again because the dream won't let him leave. He fails again and again because the dream won't let him succeed. He is a perfectly calibrated antagonist for a perfectly calibrated dreamer, always present, always foiled, never quite gone. Apu Nahasapi Mapetalon. Apu runs the Quick E-Mart, the convenience store that sits at the center of Springfield's commercial landscape with the inevitability of a landmark. He works extraordinarily long hours. He is highly educated, a doctorate from Calcutta Technical Institute. He is hardworking, conscientious, and has built something stable and functioning within the constraints of what Springfield offers. The contamination theory does not have a specific reading of Apu's situation that differs significantly from its reading of other Springfield residents. He is yellow, he has 4 fingers, he is inside the loop. What the contamination theory does note is that Apu, like several other Springfield residents who arrived from outside the town, brings with him a frame of reference that makes Springfield legible as unusual in ways that lifelong residents can't access. He knows what a normal town looks like. He came from somewhere else, and the comparison is available to him even if he has never fully articulated what it tells him about where he ended up. This is the situation of the outsider who has stayed long enough to become an insider, still capable, in quiet moments, of seeing Springfield with the eyes of someone who arrived from outside, but increasingly drawn into the shared understanding that sustains the loop. Grandpa Abe Simpson. We cannot close a section on Springfield's supporting cast without returning to Abe, because Abe's specific position in the show's larger conspiracy is one of the most significant. Abe knows. He has always known more than he says. He knows about Mona. He kept the truth from Homer for decades. He knows about the deal with Burns. He negotiated it and lived with it and never told his son. He knows about the grave he passed off as his wife's, the Walt Whitman headstone, the years of allowing Homer to grieve a person who was alive. He is not depicted as a villain. He is depicted as a limited man who made choices he thought were protective, and who never quite found the moment to undo the damage those choices caused. The contamination theory notes that Abe, as one of Springfield's older residents, has had more time than almost anyone else in the main cast to accumulate exposure. His cognitive presentation, the wandering stories, the non sequiturs, the memories that seem vivid but are often contradictory, is consistent with the long-term neurological effects of chronic low-level radiation on an aging brain. He is also, underneath all the comedy and the meandering, a man who made a deal with the entity that broke his family, and has been living with that deal for decades, and does not have the cognitive or emotional resources to fully process what it means. Abe Simpson loved his son. He also, in the most direct possible way, sold his son's life to the man who had already destroyed it. That is not a cartoon tragedy. That is the real kind. Extended, the Treehouse of Horror, what the nightmares reveal. Every Halloween, The Simpsons does something unusual. It steps outside its own continuity and tells horror stories. The Treehouse of Horror anthology episodes are explicitly non-canonical. The show's framing devices are careful to establish that what follows is not part of the regular Springfield timeline. The characters die. The rules change. The universe of the show is temporarily suspended in favor of a darker, stranger universe that the show allows itself to access only under the cover of holiday horror. But the contamination theory asks, are they really non-canonical? Consider what the Treehouse of Horror episodes have depicted across their many installments. Homer sells his soul for a donut. The family is visited by aliens who turn out to be benign before being revealed as something darker. Springfield is destroyed by various apocalyptic forces. The residents are transformed into monsters. They are consumed, invaded, mutated beyond what their regular episode mutations already represent. The surface reading is that these are parodies of established horror films and science fiction stories, of cultural anxieties about technology and invasion and death. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are funny, deliberately over the top, clearly operating in a register that the regular show doesn't inhabit. But look at the consistent themes across decades of these specials: transformation, The residents of Springfield are always being transformed into something inhuman, something monstrous, something that retains the shape of the person but is fundamentally altered at a level that can't be reversed. Loss of self. Characters in the Treehouse episodes repeatedly experience the dissolution of their identity through possession, through metamorphosis, through the replacement of their consciousness by something else. The body doing something the mind can't control. Homer's body behaving in ways that his conscious self cannot prevent or redirect. Bart's body changing against his will. The physical form as something other than a reliable expression of the person inside it. These themes, transformation, loss of self, the body as something separate from and potentially hostile to the self, are the themes of the contamination theory made explicit. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are not non-canonical departures from the show's reality. They are the regular episode's subtext with the subtlety removed. They are the contamination theory stated directly, in the language of horror rather than the language of comedy. The regular episodes show you a yellowed family going about their slightly strange lives, without quite acknowledging how strange they are. The Treehouse episodes show you what that strangeness looks like if you stop softening it. The horror is the same. Only the framing changes. There is a specific Treehouse of Horror story that the contamination theory community finds particularly resonant, and it involves Homer's food. In one of the anthology's installments, Homer eats something that should not be eaten, a form of food that is somehow wrong, somehow other, somehow a product of a process that has produced something dangerous. The consumption of this wrong food begins a transformation. Homer becomes something he wasn't, something that his body accommodates but that his self cannot fully inhabit. This plays as horror comedy, Homer struggling with his own body as it does things he doesn't want it to do. The punchline is that Homer eventually accommodates the transformation because Homer always accommodates. He is the most adaptive character in the show's history, which is itself a contamination theory observation about what chronic low-level exposure does to a biological system. It makes it adapt. It makes it resilient in the specific ways that make it useful, and incapable in the specific ways that make it safe. Homer adapts to being transformed. He integrates the horror. He comes out the other side still Homer, but different. And the difference is something he can't quite name or articulate. That is what Springfield has been doing to Homer for 36 years. The Treehouse episode just does it in 22 minutes instead of 3 decades. The coma theory has its own relationship to the Treehouse of Horror episodes, and it's worth noting. If Homer is dreaming, the Treehouse episodes are a specific kind of dream, a deeper level, a dream within the dream, in which the sleeping brain is allowed to access material it keeps suppressed in the regular dream. The fears that are too dark to run in the normal loop. The transformations that are too disturbing to acknowledge in the comfortable Springfield of the regular episodes. The Treehouse episodes are Homer's nightmares. The regular episodes are his dream. The distinction is maintained by the show's framing devices. This is not canon. This does not count. These deaths do not affect the permanent present because the dreaming mind needs to be able to access its fears in a controlled environment that doesn't contaminate the main dream with their darkness. The Halloween special is the dream's safety valve. The terror that would otherwise destabilize the loop is allowed to express itself in a contained, temporary space, and then the loop resumes. Homer dies in the Treehouse episodes. His family dies. Springfield is destroyed. The worst things happen, and then they don't count, and the loop begins again. Because the loop has to begin again. It always begins again. Ralph Wiggum and the Edge of the World. Ralph Wiggum is Chief Wiggum's son. He is a classmate of Bart and Lisa's at Springfield Elementary. He is 9 years old and has been 9 years old for 36 years, which makes him, in terms of the floating timeline, exactly what every other character in Springfield is. Suspended. Ralph Wiggum says things that don't make sense. This is his defining characteristic. He makes statements that are disconnected from the context of the conversation he's participating in. He produces observations that are internally consistent but externally incomprehensible. He responds to questions with answers that seem to come from an entirely different reality than the one the question was asked in. He is generally considered the show's funniest background character. His non-sequiturs have been quoted, collected, and celebrated by fans for decades. My cat's breath smells like cat food. I ate the purple berries. I'm a star. But the contamination theory has a reading of Ralph that is less comfortable. Ralph is 9 years old. He is the son of a man who has lived in Springfield his entire life, who was himself present at the destruction of Burns's biological weapons facility as a young adult, who has presumably been consuming the same contaminated water and breathing the same air as every other Springfield resident. Ralph was born in Springfield. He has been developing in Springfield's environment since before he was born. And Ralph says things that don't connect. Ralph's mind works in ways that don't correspond to the patterns that the people around him are using to organize their experience. He is not unintelligent. There are moments in which Ralph produces insights that are weirdly acute, that seem to come from a cognitive angle that nobody else is using. He is different in ways that are not simple or comfortable to categorize. The contamination theory doesn't claim Ralph is damaged in the way Homer is damaged. It claims he is differently configured, that his developing brain, exposed to the plant's output from before birth, organized itself around patterns that don't correspond to the ones the people around him are using. He is not wrong. He is elsewhere. His internal logic is coherent. It's just not accessible from the outside. In a contaminated town, Ralph Wiggum is the child whose development was shaped most completely by the contamination, simply because he arrived in Springfield after 2 generations of accumulated exposure had already done their work on his parents' biology. He is what Springfield looks like when the cycle completes. He sits in class next to Lisa, who sees everything, and he says, "The pointy kitty took my mouthwards," and nobody knows what to do with that, and the teacher moves on to the next lesson, and the loop continues. Extended. The couch gags as evidence. Every episode of The Simpsons begins the same way. The family races from wherever they are in Springfield toward the couch in the living room of their house on Evergreen Terrace. They sit down. Something happens, something different every episode. Something creative and surprising, and often wildly outside the show's normal parameters of possibility. The couch gag. The couch gags have become one of the show's most celebrated features. They have been directed by outside artists and animators. They have referenced art history and cinema and other animated traditions. They have been short and long and funny and conceptually ambitious. They are a signature. And the coma theory has a specific reading of them. Every episode, Homer races for the couch. Every episode, something goes wrong with the arrival. Something unexpected, something strange, something that disrupts the simple act of sitting down with his family. And every episode, by the end of the opening sequence, the family is on the couch. Together. The disruptions are different every time. The resolution is always the same. In the dream framework, the couch gag is not a comedic device. It is a recurring anxiety. Every episode, Homer's unconscious mind generates a new version of the fear that he won't make it, that something will prevent him from reaching the couch, from being where his family is, from sitting down in his place. The dream produces the fear and then resolves it, over and over, because the fear is real and because the dreaming mind needs to keep proving to itself that the resolution is possible. He always makes it. In 788 episodes, Homer Simpson has always made it to the couch. Because in the dream, he is always going to make it to the couch. The dream was built to ensure this. The couch gags are not openings, they are reassurances. They are the first thing the dream does at the beginning of each cycle. Remind itself that Homer gets to sit down with his family, that he is home, that everything is still intact, that the loop is still running. Every single episode, extended, the golden age, and the question of when the show became itself, there is a critical consensus about The Simpsons that has been stable for over 20 years. The show has a golden age, and that golden age ended. The golden age is generally placed somewhere between seasons 3 and 8, with the precise boundaries argued about with the kind of fervor that only fans of something they deeply care about can sustain. These are the episodes that make the best of lists. These are the episodes people remember when they think about The Simpsons at its most essential. Cape Fear, Marge versus. The Monorail, Homer at the Bat, Last Exit to Springfield, Homer's Enemy, You Only Move Twice, and dozens of others that exist in the memory of a generation of viewers as television that achieved something genuinely rare. After the Golden Age, the consensus says, the show became something different, still popular, still capable of occasional brilliance, but somehow changed at a fundamental level, less grounded, more chaotic, more willing to sacrifice character consistency for a joke, less capable of the emotional depth that made the best early episodes devastating. The coma theory maps onto this critical consensus with suspicious precision. The coma episode is Season 4, Episode 18. The Golden Age begins before it and extends for a few years after it, which the coma theory explains as the dream's early, high coherence phase, and then begins to shift in exactly the ways the theory would predict. More elaborate, less grounded, less emotionally coherent, increasingly disconnected from the constraints of realistic human motivation. The critical consensus about when the show changed is essentially, unknowingly, a description of the coma theory's central argument. The show changed because Homer changed. Homer changed because he went into a coma. The shift is real, it is documented, it has been argued about for 20 years, and the coma theory says, you have been describing the moment a man's consciousness left his body and the dream took over. You have been correct. You just didn't have the framework to understand what you were describing. This is the thing about the best fan theories. They reframe existing observations rather than introducing new ones. They take the things that attentive viewers already noticed: the tonal shift, the character inconsistency, the escalating surrealism, the emotional distance of the later seasons, and provide a framework that makes those observations coherent. The Golden Age argument is not a product of nostalgia, though nostalgia amplifies it. It is a product of genuine observation about the show's texture across its history. Something changed. Something real and structural changed around the middle of the show's run. The coma theory says the something was Homer's consciousness. The contamination theory says the something was the accumulation of damage both in the characters and, in a meta sense, in the show's ability to tell certain kinds of stories about those characters once they were fully contaminated. The grounded early episodes were possible because the characters still had enough cognitive and emotional integrity to inhabit realistic human situations. The later episodes floated free of that groundedness because the contamination had finally done enough work that the realistic situations were no longer accessible. Both theories are, in a sense, saying the same thing from different angles. The show's history is not random. The changes it underwent are not arbitrary. They trace a specific arc that has a specific cause. And once you can see the cause, the arc becomes legible in a way it wasn't before. Extended, what Springfield says about America. We have been in Springfield for a long time now, long enough to have absorbed the contamination theory, and the coma, and the Burns conspiracy, and the denial machinery, and the silence of Maggie, and the persistence of Lisa, and the tragedy of Ned, and the mystery of the town's location, and the floating timeline that holds everyone in place. Long enough, perhaps, to step back and ask the largest question the show implicitly poses. What is Springfield for? The obvious answer is that Springfield is a vehicle for comedy, a setting that has been constructed to support a specific kind of satirical humor about American domestic life, American politics, American culture, American excess. That is what the show is, in commercial terms. That is why it was made and why it airs and why people watch it. But the theories suggest a deeper purpose, one that the show has been pursuing consciously or not alongside its commercial purpose. Springfield is a mirror. It was built to show America something about itself, and the something it shows has remained more or less consistent across 36 years of episodes, even as everything around the show changed. The mirror shows, here is a town where one man owns everything and faces no accountability. Here is a population that has been damaged by that man's choices and has developed, through decades of accumulated damage, an inability to recognize the damage or its source. Here is the infrastructure that sustains the damage, the corrupt police chief, the incompetent politician, the medical establishment that looks away, the school system that fails the children who need it most. Here is what it looks like when a community chooses comfort over truth so consistently and for so long that the choice has become invisible. Here is America. Not all of America, not America at its best, not the America that anyone builds monuments to. The America that sits at the center of the middle of the country and watches a billionaire block out the sun and re-elects the corrupt mayor and lets the safety inspector sleep at his console and buys electricity from the plant that poisons the water. That America. The one that has always been there. The one that The Simpsons has been depicting for 36 years without once suggesting that it's anything other than exactly what it is. The show is funny. The jokes are good. The characters are beloved. And underneath all of it, the mirror keeps reflecting, and the thing in the mirror keeps looking back. The show has never claimed to be doing anything more than entertaining people. Its creators have consistently resisted the idea that there is a grand unified theory of Springfield, a hidden meaning, a message that the audience is supposed to extract from the accumulated evidence of all those episodes. But the evidence exists whether the creators intended it or not. The patterns are there. The contamination theory didn't invent the 342 violations or the three-eyed fish or the yellow skin. Those are in the show, written by people who were, consciously or not, building a picture of something. The coma theory didn't invent the tonal shift after season 4, or the frozen ages, or the celebrity flood. Those are in the show, observable by anyone who watches carefully enough. The theories are responses to real patterns in a real text. They are the work of people who watched a cartoon and refused to look away from the things it was showing them, the things it was showing them over and over, season after season, with the kind of repetition that suggests intention even when no intention is claimed. Springfield is trying to tell you something. The theories are different translations of the same message. They arrive at different conclusions about mechanism and cause, but they agree about the fundamental fact. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something has always been wrong in Springfield. And the town, the show, the loop, the audience, none of us has ever quite found the will to fix it. Because fixing it would mean the end. And we are not ready for the end. Extended. The economics of Springfield, a working-class town that works. One of the things that made The Simpsons so distinctive when it premiered in 1989 was its economic specificity. Homer Simpson worked a specific kind of job at a specific kind of facility, and the pressures that job created, the inadequate salary, the difficult boss, the sense of being permanently one crisis away from a real problem, were pressures that American working-class families recognized. The show was, in its early seasons, about financial anxiety in a way that most television in that era was not. The networks were not in the habit of centering working-class economic struggle as a primary dramatic concern. The family sitcoms of the preceding decades had tended to feature families who were comfortable without being fabulously wealthy, but comfortable in a way that felt aspirational rather than precarious. Their money worries, when they had them, resolved within the episode. Homer's money worries had weight. They came back. They accumulated. The house was mortgaged. The cars were unreliable. The credit cards had balances. The prospect of losing the job was not a plot device. It was a real threat with real consequences. And the job itself was the show's most pointed economic statement. Homer Simpson works at a nuclear power plant that is owned by the richest man in town. He works in proximity to materials that are actively dangerous to his health. He earns a salary that is adequate for a modest life, but which provides no real cushion against the unexpected. He has no meaningful power within his workplace. Burns can and does threaten his employment at will, and Homer's response is not resistance but accommodation, because what choice does he have? This is a portrait of the American working class that is specific and uncomfortable and accurate in ways that the show has never fully received credit for. The contamination theory reads Homer's economic situation through the same lens it reads everything else. Burns structured Homer's employment not despite its exploitative qualities, but because of them. A well-paid, secure, genuinely protected workforce at the plant would have had the resources and the stability to organize, to complain, to consult lawyers, to seek independent assessments of the plant's safety record. A workforce paid barely enough, in jobs that are the only available option in a town whose economy Burns controls, has no such recourse. The economic precarity is a feature of the control system. Poverty is a compliance mechanism. When you are always one missed paycheck away from a crisis, you cannot afford to be the person who asks the difficult questions about the cooling towers. You cannot afford to be Frank Grimes. You cannot afford to be the one who notices the three-eyed fish and starts asking what else might be in the water. You go to work. You do the job badly. You eat the donut. You go home. This is not a metaphor. This is the operating logic of the kind of company town that Springfield is, stripped of its cartoon softening. The floating timeline has had an interesting effect on the show's depiction of Homer's economic situation. In the early seasons, the specificity of Homer's financial situation was part of what grounded the show. In later seasons, as the floating timeline moved the present forward while keeping the characters at their original ages and life stages, the financial specificity became increasingly inconsistent. Homer has, over the show's run, received enough pay raises and windfalls and prizes to have alleviated the financial precarity of the early seasons many times over. He has found treasure. He has won contests. He has held second jobs that paid extraordinarily well. He has, on multiple occasions, come into possession of resources that should have permanently altered his family's economic situation, and none of it sticks. The family always returns to the same baseline. The same modest house, the same reliable enough cars, the same borderline adequate income from the plant. The denial theory says, the town resets, and Homer's finances reset with it. The dream theory says, Homer's unconscious mind cannot maintain a version of his life that is financially comfortable because financial comfort was not part of his self-image when he went under. The contamination theory says, the same cognitive impairment that prevents Homer from noticing the three-eyed fish prevents him from maintaining any financial gains he manages to achieve. In each reading, the result is the same. Homer stays at the same economic level. The windfall is forgotten. The second job ends. The prize money is spent or lost or simply disappears. The family is back at square one by the following week. This is not realistic, but it is accurate. It captures something true about what it feels like to be in a certain economic position, the sense that no matter how much improvement occurs, the baseline reasserts itself. That the improvements are temporary, and the precarity is permanent. Homer's family lives in a loop within a loop. The outer loop is Springfield's refusal to change. The inner loop is their own financial reality, which circles around the same modest house and the same modest income, and never quite reaches anything that lasts. There is one specific economic element of the show that the contamination and Burns' immortality theories find particularly significant. The power plant as monopoly. Burns controls Springfield's electricity. There is no competing energy provider. There is no alternative to the plant. The residents of Springfield are entirely dependent on a single source of power that is owned by the man who also employs a significant portion of the workforce, who influences the local government, who has the police chief in his corner, who has been demonstrably willing to use his resources against private citizens who cross him, blocking the sun in Who Shot Mr. Burns was Burns' most theatrical expression of this monopoly, but the monopoly itself is the underlying reality. Every light that turns on in Springfield is Burns' light. Every appliance that runs, every business that operates, every hospital that stays open, all of it depends on Burns choosing to keep the plant running. He is, in the most literal possible sense, the person who keeps the lights on in Springfield. And the town knows this, which is why the loop maintains, which is why the vote is unanimous, which is why the real Skinner is on the train, and the violations stay at 342 and Homer keeps his job and nobody tests the water. The lights have to stay on. And keeping the lights on means keeping Burns in place. And keeping Burns in place means not asking the questions that would require his removal. The economics of Springfield are not a backdrop. They are the mechanism. Follow the money and you find the loop. Follow the loop and you find Burns. Follow Burns and you find the plant. Follow the plant and you find the water. Follow the water and you find Blinky. Follow Blinky and you're back at the beginning. 3 eyes wide, swimming in slow circles, in a river that glows at night. Extended. The religion of Springfield. What God owes Ned Flanders. We have already discussed Ned Flanders in the context of his psychological history, the childhood conditioning, the suppressed rage, the endless patience that is not a virtue but a programming. But there is a theological dimension to Ned's story that deserves its own examination, because the show has been remarkably specific about how God operates in Springfield, and the specificity is not reassuring. God exists in Springfield. This is not ambiguous or metaphorical. God has appeared on screen, spoken to characters, and intervened in plots with a frequency that establishes the divine as a genuine operating presence in the show's universe. God is a character. God has spoken to Homer at least twice in extended, substantive conversations. God has appeared to Homer in visions that affected his behavior. God, in at least one episode, plays a direct role in a Springfield plotline as a participant rather than an abstraction. In 36 years of episodes, God has not spoken to Ned Flanders. Not once. Ned prays constantly. He is shown praying at the beginning of every day, before meals, in times of crisis, in times of gratitude. In times of what he's been conditioned to present as serenity, even when every visible indicator suggests the opposite. Ned's relationship with God is the organizing principle of his life, the framework that makes sense of everything else, that provides the explanation for why things happen the way they do, that offers the promise that suffering is meaningful because it serves a larger purpose. And God in Springfield is clearly paying attention to some people. Homer gets conversations. Homer gets appearances. Homer gets the divine presence in his corner when the dream needs it. Ned gets silence. The contamination theory's reading of this is blunt. The God of Springfield is not a divine being operating according to theological logic. The God of Springfield is a product of the same contaminated environment that produced everything else in Springfield. God appears to Homer because Homer's damaged brain generates the experience of divine communication, a neurological event shaped by the specific way radiation has altered Homer's cognitive architecture. The experience is real to Homer. It is not necessarily real in the way it presents itself. Ned's prayers go unanswered not because God is cruel or indifferent, but because Ned's cognitive architecture does not generate the experience of divine response. His conditioning, his suppression, his carefully maintained emotional control, all of it prevents the kind of dissociative, liminal cognitive state in which the experience of divine communication is most likely to occur. Ned is too controlled. Homer is barely controlled at all. In the contamination framework, God talking to Homer is not a sign of divine favor. It is a sign of brain damage operating in a specific direction. The coma theory's reading is different and sadder. Homer's dream gives him God because the dreaming mind needs comfort of the most fundamental kind. It needs to feel that the universe is not indifferent to his situation. It needs a divine presence that recognizes him, speaks to him, occasionally intervenes on his behalf. The dream doesn't give Ned God because Ned is not Homer's primary concern. Ned is a supporting character in Homer's dream. He doesn't get the same access to the dream's resources that Homer does. And Ned, in the dream, keeps praying anyway, keeps attending church, keeps organizing his entire life around a faith that the dream has decided not to answer. There is something very dark in that image, even if it isn't intentional. A man praying to a God that is listening, that is clearly, demonstrably listening to the person next door and hearing nothing in return. The show has never resolved this. It has never addressed it directly. It has, in the way that The Simpsons handles its deepest implications, simply shown it repeatedly and trusted the audience to sit with what it means. God talks to Homer. Homer is unreliable, selfish, cognitively compromised, and blessed. God ignores Ned. Ned is disciplined, devoted, morally serious, and bereaved. This is either the show making a sophisticated theological argument about the arbitrary nature of divine favor grace as something that cannot be earned, that operates outside any human logic of merit, or it is the show making a far more cynical observation about who the universe, such as it is, actually takes care of. The cynical observation would be, the universe takes care of people who don't think too hard, who don't demand too much of themselves, who move through the world with Homer's specific combination of selfishness and openness and refusal to be permanently brought down by anything. The universe does not take care of people who do everything right, who hold themselves to standards, who give more than they take, and pray more than they complain. The universe, in Springfield, is Burns's universe. And Burns's universe runs on the same logic as Burns's plant. The people who make the system work, who enable the violations to continue, who don't ask the hard questions, they are protected. They are employed. They are, in their way, loved. The people who would fix things, who can see clearly, who try to hold the system to account, they are exiled on trains. Their prayers go unanswered. Their houses fall down. That's the theology of Springfield. It has always been the theology of Springfield. Extended. The music of Springfield Lisa's saxophone and what it carries. Lisa Simpson plays the saxophone. This is a fact so embedded in the show's identity that it barely registers as a creative choice anymore. It's simply what Lisa does. She plays the saxophone, she is good at it, and the instrument appears in enough plot contexts to establish that it is central to who she is, rather than incidental. But the saxophone is a strange choice for a child prodigy in a 1990s animated sitcom. The show's creators could have given Lisa piano, the classical instrument of choice, the one that reads most naturally as talented child who practices diligently. They could have given her violin, or cello, or any of the instruments that carry cultural associations with high achievement and classical training. They gave her the saxophone, an instrument with jazz associations, with blues associations, with the associations of American music that is specifically urban, specifically expressive, specifically rooted in a tradition of using music to process the kinds of experiences that language cannot adequately hold. Lisa plays jazz on her saxophone. She plays blues on her saxophone. She plays the kind of music that, in its traditional forms, was made by people who were living in difficult circumstances and found in music the container for everything they could not otherwise express. Lisa is 8 years old. She lives in Springfield. She is surrounded by conditions that she can see clearly and cannot change. And she plays the saxophone. The coma theory's reading of this is that Homer, in his dream, gave his daughter the instrument because it expresses the thing he feels most clearly. He is in a coma. He cannot speak. He cannot tell his family what is happening to him or what he needs or how much he loves them. But music, the blues, the jazz, the music of people who have been through something and survived it and made beauty out of the survival, that is the language that the dream knows. Lisa plays for her father. The dream gave her the instrument so she could say the things he cannot say himself. Every time she plays alone in her room, on a street corner, in the school orchestra pit, she is playing for him. And somewhere in the dream, in the hospital room that the dream refuses to show clearly, the music reaches him. He can still hear it. Extended, the show about endings that never ends. Every story has an ending. Even the longest stories, the ones that span decades and generations, and seem to have accumulated enough mass that they could continue indefinitely, even those stories end. The characters age out, the audience moves on. The cultural moment that made the story possible passes. The Simpsons has defied this logic for over 36 years. It is the show that cannot end, the story that will not resolve, the loop that keeps looping past every point at which a rational assessment of its situation would say, this is where the story closes. The show has been renewed for future seasons repeatedly, each renewal extending a run that already seemed improbable. There have been rumors of endings, hints of finales, moments at which the show seemed to be setting up for a conclusion that then didn't arrive. The end keeps not coming. The coma theory, which has been our companion throughout this script, has a specific reading of the show's inability to end. Homer's brain will not stop dreaming. That is the theory's most fundamental claim. The dream continues because the dreamer cannot find his way to either of the available exits, consciousness or death. He is in the space between them, generating the dream of his family with whatever resources remain to him, maintaining the loop, because the alternative, the silence on the other side of the dream, is something the brain refuses to reach. The show ending would be Homer waking up or Homer dying. Either way, the dream stops. Either way, Springfield disappears. And so, the dream continues. Episode by episode, season by season. The same family on the same couch, in the same house, on the same street, in the same town that cannot be found on any map. The show about endings that never ends is the dream of a man who cannot afford to end. There is something in this that goes beyond the theory's mechanics, beyond the intellectual puzzle of how all the evidence fits together. Something that becomes, in the small hours of a long night spent thinking about a cartoon family, almost unbearably poignant. Homer Simpson is, by every conventional measure, a failure. He is not smart. He is not capable in any sustained way. He has not achieved anything that the world would recognize as significant. He works a job that anyone could have and has worked it badly. He has caused more disasters than he has prevented. He has hurt people through carelessness and neglect. He has failed his family in ways that the show has documented with considerable care across hundreds of episodes. And he loves them, completely, unconditionally, without the qualifications that more sophisticated people apply to love. He loves Marge with the single-minded devotion of a man who knows he is lucky to be loved in return. He loves his children with the fierce, inarticulate intensity of someone who does not have the words for the thing he feels but has never for a moment doubted the feeling itself. This love is the dream's engine. This love is what the coma brain is running on. Not intellect, not capability, not any of the things that the world would recognize as assets. Just the love. The specific, irreducible Homer Simpson love for his specific, irreducible family. If the coma theory is true, if the dream is real, and Homer is still in that hospital room, then the entire show, all 800 episodes, all 36 years, all the explosions and guest stars and prophecies and mysteries and three-eyed fish is a love story. The longest, strangest, most elaborate love story in television history. A man in a hospital bed, loving his family so completely that his brain won't stop telling their story. We have reached the end of our time in Springfield. Or rather, we have reached a pause because Springfield doesn't really end. The loop runs on. The show continues. New episodes air and find the family in the same house, at the same ages, with the same dynamic and the same love, and the same impossibility of ever quite resolving. But we can pause here. We can sit with what we've found. The contamination is real, in the logic of the show's own universe. The cracked cooling towers, the 342 violations, the three-eyed fish, the yellow skin, the impaired cognition, the arrested aging, the evidence is there, episode after episode, quietly accumulated across a show that never quite says out loud what it keeps showing. The coma is real, in the emotional logic of the show's structure. The frozen ages, the tonal shift, the celebrity flood, the escalating surrealism, the dream logic that increasingly governs the later seasons. These things trace a specific arc that has a specific origin and a specific cause. The conspiracy is real, in the narrative logic of the Burns storyline. Mona's exile, Homer's damage, Abe's deal, the guaranteed employment, the plant's protected violations, these connect to each other with a coherence that suggests design, even if the show has never used the word conspiracy about them. The denial is real in the social logic of Springfield's community. The vote, the decree, the exile of the real Skinner, the collective agreement to treat truth as criminal, these are not anomalies in Springfield's history. They are its defining practice. All of it is real. All of it is there. All you have to do is look. And now it is late. Or it is early. The hour has become ambiguous in the way that hours do when you have been somewhere like Springfield for a long time, when you have followed the theories this far down, when you have sat with the contamination and the dream and the mystery of who fired the gun and the silence of the baby and the patience of the woman who plays the saxophone alone in her room, the theories don't resolve the show. They were never meant to. The show is not a puzzle with a solution. It is a mirror, and mirrors don't solve anything. They reflect. And what they reflect, if you look long enough, is not Springfield. It's you, looking back. Find a comfortable position now. The voice is going to slow down. The ideas are going to drift apart, the way things do when sleep is coming, and the mind is releasing its grip on the need to understand everything. Let the theories dissolve into impressions. Let the contamination become just the image of cooling towers against a gray sky. Let the coma become just the image of a man resting in a hospital bed, somewhere, dreaming. Let the mystery of the shooting become just the image of a baby watching from a high chair, enormous eyes seeing everything, saying nothing. Let Springfield be Springfield, yellow and strange and impossible and somehow, despite all of it, warm. The lights are on. The plant is running. Homer is on the couch. His family is with him. The loop is still running. It will still be running when you wake up. Final extended. A complete accounting all the threads one last time. Let's be very still for a moment and let the full picture come together. We started with a fish, a three-eyed fish in a river near a nuclear plant with 342 violations. We asked the question everyone in Springfield forgot to ask. If the fish are mutated, what has happened to the people? We followed that question through the yellow skin and the four fingers and the suspended aging and the impaired cognition and the man who once had a crayon in his brain and chose to put it back. We followed it through the cooling towers and the waste barrels thrown from car windows and the luminous rats in the facility's basement and the human skeletons that nobody ever explained. We found Burns at the center, not just as the plant's owner, not just as the villain in a cartoon, but as the specific mechanism by which one man's desire for power and control and one man's unusually long time in which to pursue that desire has shaped the lives of every person in Springfield. His biological weapons lab, his pursuit of Mona Simpson across decades, his deal with Abe, his strategic employment of Homer. His weekly treatments that keep him alive through what amounts to managed radiation exposure, the same substance he has been releasing into the water supply that feeds the town he controls. We found Homer, damaged and loving and too cognitively compromised to see the architecture of his own suffering, but finding his way home every evening at 5:30 because the dream, if it is a dream, will not let him miss the couch. We found his coma and the tonal shift it produces, and the way the later seasons map onto the degradation of a brain that is working harder and harder to sustain a story that demands more and more. We found Maggie, watching from behind the pacifier. Knowing things that nobody else knows, she knows. Patient with a patience that is not passivity, that is strategy. Waiting for the moment that she has decided on through 36 years of careful, silent observation. We don't know what that moment looks like. She does. We found Lisa, still asking questions, still being told the questions don't matter, still playing the saxophone at the end of the day because music holds the things that Springfield will not let her say in any other form. We found Ned, whose goodness was built for him rather than chosen, and whose prayers go unanswered in a town where God talks to Homer, and who has been the most specifically treated character in the show's roster, more damaged, more specifically, than anyone except perhaps Homer, because at least Homer doesn't know what's wrong with him. We found the denial machinery, the vote, the decree, the exile, the train, and understood that Springfield's amnesia is not a symptom but a policy, not something that happens to the town but something the town does to itself, with full awareness on a recurring basis, because the alternative is a clarity that would require confronting everything at once. We found the conspiracy across 3 generations, Mona, Abe, Homer, and traced the line from Burns's grudge against a woman who destroyed his weapons lab to the man who works at his plant decades later, unaware that the man who signs his checks is the man who shaped his life before he was old enough to be aware of it. We found the geographic mystery and understood it as both artistic philosophy and legal strategy, a town that cannot be located, cannot be regulated, and a town that cannot be regulated continues to accumulate its violations undisturbed. We found the floating timeline and recognized it as the show's most honest statement about its audience, that we have built the loop as much as Springfield has, that our need for the family to stay young and safe and together is the force that holds the stasis in place, that we are as much inside the loop as Homer. Every theory in this script is pointing at the same thing, not at a specific episode, not at a specific mistake or inconsistency or hidden message, at something more fundamental than any of those, at the question of what it means to be trapped somewhere that feels like home. Springfield traps its residents. The contamination traps them in altered bodies with altered minds. The denial traps them in a version of reality that has been legally enforced. The economics trap them in dependency on the man whose choices damaged them. The coma traps Homer in a dream he can't wake up from. And we, watching, are trapped too. Trapped by love, by memory, by the specific attachment to a fictional family that we have been building for decades. Trapped by the version of ourselves that first watched this show, and the couch that we watched it from, and the people who were on the couch with us and may not be anymore. Springfield is where we go when we need to go somewhere that doesn't change. When the world outside is moving too fast and the people we love are getting older, and the life we thought we were building has taken unexpected shapes, we go back to Evergreen Terrace. We sit down on the couch, we press play, and Homer is still there, and Marge is still patient, and Bart is still 10, and Lisa is still 8, and Maggie is still watching. Nothing has changed. Nothing ever changes. That's the mystery and the comfort and the horror and the beauty of Springfield, all at once, inseparable from each other. You are going to fall asleep now, if you haven't already. The voice is going to get softer. The sentences are going to get shorter and further apart. The ideas that have been moving through this space for hours are going to settle. The way things settle when sleep is coming, not disappearing, just going still. Sinking to the bottom of the mind where they'll wait, available when you need them, quiet for now. Let the theories go for tonight. You can pick them up tomorrow, look at them in the daylight, follow a thread you didn't follow tonight. For now, let Springfield be what it is in the last moments before sleep. A warm light in a yellow house on a street that could be anywhere. A family sitting down to dinner. The sound of a saxophone from upstairs. The smell of something Homer tried to cook and mostly succeeded. The cooling towers are visible from the window if you look. But tonight, don't look. Tonight, just let the family be together. Let the loop run. Let Bart be 10 and Lisa be 8 and Maggie be watching from her high chair with her enormous knowing eyes. Let Homer fall through the door and say something that makes everyone laugh. Let Marge put her hand on his arm and everything be, for a moment, fine. Let Springfield be Springfield. Let the dream run on. Good night wherever you are. Good night. End of script. Bonus. 5 more theories the show buried in plain sight. We are not quite done. A few loose threads remain, smaller theories, less explored, each one a thread that the show introduced and then left hanging. They deserve at least a resting place before we close. The theory that Springfield's time moves sideways, not forward. We have discussed the floating timeline extensively, the way the characters don't age, the way the present is always the viewer's present, the way Homer and Marge's backstory has been rewritten multiple times to fit whatever decade the show is currently inhabiting. But there is a more radical reading of Springfield's temporal situation that has circulated in fan communities for years, and it suggests something stranger than simple stasis. The theory is this: Springfield doesn't exist in a frozen time or a looping time. Springfield exists in branching time. Every episode is a branch, a separate reality that diverges from all the others at the moment it begins and converges back to the shared baseline at the moment it ends. The characters don't remember what happened in previous episodes, not because they've forgotten and not because the show is lazy about continuity, but because the version of Homer in any given episode is not quite the same Homer who experienced the previous episode. He is a close relative, sharing the same baseline characteristics, but existing in a parallel strand of Springfield's temporal fabric. This explains the inconsistencies that neither the coma theory nor the contamination theory fully address. Why does Homer sometimes remember a significant event from a previous episode, and sometimes doesn't? Why do relationships reset in ways that can't be explained purely by amnesia? Why does the show, in certain episodes, seem to be operating from a slightly different set of foundational assumptions about the characters than other episodes? Because each episode is drawing from a slightly different version of Springfield. The same Springfield, but not quite the same timeline. The contamination theory would have a specific explanation for this. The radiation from the plant has not just altered the residents biologically, it has altered the local space-time in ways that produce this branching that cause the timeline to fork and refold in ways that are invisible to the residents, but visible to a careful external observer. Springfield is not just a contaminated town. It is a town where the fabric of time itself has been damaged by decades of nuclear exposure. This is the theory at its most speculative, but it is also the theory that explains the most with the fewest additional assumptions. The theory about Krusty the Clown. Herschel Schmoikel Pinchas Yerucham Krustovsky, known professionally as Krusty the Clown, is one of Springfield's most significant secondary characters. He runs a children's entertainment empire. He is a complex figure, self-destructive and occasionally cruel, redeemed in flashes by genuine affection for the children who watch him and the colleagues who work for him, undone repeatedly by his own appetites and limitations. Krusty is also, the theory notes, Bart Simpson's idol. This relationship, a child who idolizes a clown who is secretly miserable, has been the subject of several significant episodes, most notably the revelation that Krusty is estranged from his rabbi father, who disapproves of his son's career in entertainment. The reunion of Krusty and his father is one of the show's genuinely affecting moments. But the deeper theory about Krusty is structural rather than biographical. The theory argues that Krusty is the version of Bart's future that the show can't depict directly. Krusty is what happens when a kid who doesn't fit the normal expectations of his community, who is funny and charismatic and finds the rules oppressive, grows up inside the loop. He doesn't break free. He doesn't find a way out. He finds a way to monetize the performance of rebellion for children, and in doing so, participates fully in the system he might once have wanted to resist. Krusty is a sellout in the technical sense. He sold his actual self for the version of himself that the market would reward. And he is deeply, specifically unhappy in the way that people are unhappy when they have been successful at becoming something they didn't mean to become. Bart worships Krusty. The theory suggests that some part of Bart, the part that can see a little further than 10-year-olds are typically able to see, recognizes in Krusty the cautionary tale, the road he might take, the version of himself that survives Springfield, but at a cost. It is a theory about what the show does with its most beloved characters when they grow up in a contaminated system. and it is not an encouraging theory. The theory about Snowball and the pets of Springfield. The Simpson family's succession of cats, all named Snowball, all white or mostly white, has been the subject of various fan observations, mostly centered on the show's somewhat cavalier relationship with pet death. Cats die and are replaced. The family accepts this with a facility that might read as callousness or might read as the particular pragmatism that families develop around pet mortality. But the contamination theory finds the pets significant for a different reason. The animals of Springfield are canaries. They are the most sensitive indicators of the environmental conditions. The residents are living in more sensitive than humans because their smaller bodies concentrate environmental toxins faster, because their shorter lifespans mean the effects of chronic exposure accumulate more quickly, because their proximity to the ground puts them in direct contact with contaminated soil and water at a level that the bipedal residents partly avoid. The Simpsons' pets are sick. They die at rates that should prompt questions. The succession of snowballs is not a joke about the disposability of cats. It is the show quietly noting that nothing in the Simpson household stays alive very long in this environment. Santa's little helper, the family dog, has survived longer than the cats, but has required significant veterinary attention across the show's history, with health problems that are generally attributed to his breed, but which the contamination theory reads as consistent with chronic environmental exposure. The animals are telling you what the people are too contaminated to tell themselves. If you want to know how bad it is in Springfield, don't look at the people. Look at what's happening to the cats. The theory that Homer has died multiple times. This theory sits at the intersection of the contamination theory and the coma theory, and it requires accepting the most extreme version of both. Homer has, across the show's history, survived things that would be immediately fatal to any normal human being. Falls from heights that should be fatal, electrocutions that should be fatal, being struck by vehicles that should be fatal, explosions, submersions, impacts with blunt objects at velocities that should be fatal. He has flatlined, been resuscitated, flatlined again. He has on multiple occasions been officially pronounced dead before recovering. The contamination theory explains this through mutation. His body has been so thoroughly altered by decades of radiation exposure that it heals at impossible rates, survives damage that normal tissue cannot survive, regenerates in ways that challenge any conventional understanding of human biology. But the more extreme reading, the one that combines the contamination and the coma theories in their most uncompromising forms, argues that Homer has died multiple times, and that each apparent recovery is not a recovery but a reset. A new iteration of Homer, generated by the dreaming brain after the previous iteration has reached a terminal state. The dream doesn't let Homer stay dead because the dream cannot afford to, so it resets him, produces a new Homer from the same template, with the same memories up to the point of death, starting fresh. Each strangling, each explosion, each electrocution that should end him the dream runs the event and then rewinds. Not because the rules of the dream's universe prevent Homer's death, but because the dreamer keeps pressing rewind. Homer is unkillable in this theory because he has already died many times, and each time the dream that contains him has simply started the episode over. The final theory, the show knows. This is not a theory about Springfield's world. It is a theory about the show itself, about the relationship between the writers and the material they have been working with for 36 years. The theory is simple. The writers know what the show is doing. They know about the contamination, the coma, the denial machinery, the Burns conspiracy. They know because they wrote it. Not necessarily in the sense that they sat down and planned a unified theory of Springfield across hundreds of episodes. That kind of unified intention is probably too much to claim. But in the sense that writers who are paying attention to their own material, who are living inside a fictional universe for years and decades, develop a specific kind of knowledge about what that universe contains. They know what lives underneath the comedy. They have always known. The jokes about the plant's violations, the jokes about Blinky, the jokes about Homer's cognitive limitations, these are all jokes that only work if the reality underneath them is real. The comedy requires the horror as its foundation. You cannot make good jokes about 342 safety violations without understanding on some level what 342 safety violations actually represents. The show knows what it is. The show chooses, for reasons of audience maintenance and commercial viability, and the specific comedic register it has occupied for 36 years, not to say directly what it knows. It shows you instead, it shows you Blinky and the yellow skin and the cracked cooling towers and the sleeping inspector. It shows you the vote and the decree and the real Skinner on his train. It shows you Burns glowing in the dark after his treatments and Homer choosing to put the crayon back in. It shows you everything, and then it plays the couch gag and the theme music and keeps going. The show is not unaware of what it's been building. The show is an author who has decided that the best way to tell this particular story is to never quite finish telling it, to leave the reader, the viewer, with all the evidence assembled and the conclusion unspoken, to trust that the audience, if it looks carefully enough, will do the last step itself. You did the last step. You spent this time looking. The show knew you would. It was counting on you.